Welcome back to Terrified Tales, where the rain falls slow and the fear creeps in quicker. Like and subscribe before we begin, and tell us where and when you're listening. Midnight, alone, that's when they find you. Evelyn Hayes stepped out of her car and onto the overgrown driveway of the Hollowthorne estate, the weight of her past trailing behind her like an unwelcome shadow. The estate was just as she remembered, though the years had painted it in a different light. Where once there had been laughter, light and warmth, now only the desolate, decaying remnants of an ancient house remained, haunted by silence. The estate stood at the edge of a forest, its thick trees and wild vegetation creeping toward the house as though trying to reclaim what was once theirs. The sky, an oppressive shade of grey, seemed to press down on the land, a silent warning to anyone who might enter. The wind carried with it the scent of damp earth and the faint trace of something long forgotten, a smell of decay that seemed to come from the very foundation of the house. Evelyn had arrived alone. She hadn't spoken to her mother in years, nor had she visited the estate since that fateful day, the day of her brother's death. Her younger brother, Samuel, had drowned in the lake behind the house. It had been an accident, or so everyone said. But Evelyn had never believed it. She had always been there, standing on the shore, watching him struggle against the water. And though she reached out her hand, though she screamed for help, she was too late. The water swallowed him whole, and with him, the last trace of her innocence. She had come to Hollowthorne not for answers, not for closure, but for silence. The weight of her guilt was unbearable, and the only thing that had ever soothed her in the years since was nature, plants, trees, the comforting rustle of leaves. She had thought that maybe here, amidst the wild gardens and forgotten pathways, she could find the peace she so desperately craved. As she approached the house, she could hear the faint sound of wind through the trees. The branches swayed, their movements slow and deliberate, as if they were trying to communicate something ancient and unspoken. But Evelyn ignored it. She had no time for superstition or old stories. She had come for something real, something solid, something to quiet the ever-present hum of guilt inside her. The front door, once grand and imposing, now sagged on its hinges. The house, once filled with light and life, had grown dark and hollow, its windows staring out like lifeless eyes. The first step inside felt like stepping into the past, as though she were walking through a memory that didn't belong to her. The air was stale, thick with dust and the scent of mildew. Her footsteps echoed in the silence, loud against the stillness of the house. She walked through the abandoned hallways, her fingers brushing against the wallpaper, now peeling and faded. The house felt like a tomb, the walls echoing with long-forgotten voices. But there was something else here, something that stirred beneath the surface of the house. A faint vibration that made her skin prickle, a sensation she couldn't quite place, but that sent a shiver down her spine. In the back of the house she found the garden, the thorns of silence. She had heard of them, of course. Everyone in the town had. They were the centerpiece of the Hollowthorne estate, planted by her ancestors and tended with obsessive care. The flowers were said to be rare, nearly impossible to grow anywhere else. They were blood red, with long, twisted stems that seemed to pulse with an unnatural life. Some people claimed the thorns could trap a person's voice, stealing their words and leaving them mute. Others whispered that they could steal memories, silencing the past until there was nothing left but the present. Evelyn knelt before the garden, staring at the flowers with a mixture of fascination and unease. Below, petals glistened in the dim light, and as she leaned closer, she could hear the faintest hum, so soft that it was almost imperceptible. It was as though the flowers were alive, breathing, calling to her. Her heart raced. It was a strange sound, not unpleasant, but not quite natural either. She had heard it before, not in the garden, but in her dreams. It was the same sound that had haunted her since her brother's death. The sound of something slipping away, of something lost and never to be found again. Evelyn's breath hitched. She was trembling, but she couldn't pull herself away. She leaned in closer, reaching out a tentative hand toward one of the thorns, her fingers brushing against the cool petals. The hum grew louder, more insistent, almost as if the garden were responding to her touch. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the hum stopped. The silence that followed was so complete, so overwhelming that it seemed to swallow everything else. It pressed in on her from all sides, and Evelyn felt her heart beat in her chest, loud and frantic, as though the silence itself was suffocating her. She pulled her hand back quickly, her breath ragged, and stood up, staring at the flowers with wide, unblinking eyes. Her pulse raced, and her skin crawled. What was this place? Her mind, so accustomed to the weight of guilt and the noise of her inner turmoil, had never known such a profound quiet. She had come seeking peace, but this silence, this unnatural stillness felt like a lie that spoke of things better left forgotten. In the distance, the faintest whisper of her name echoed through the garden. Evelyn froze. She turned toward the sound, but there was no one there, only the wind, carrying with it the faint scent of the thorns. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They called to her in the voice of someone she couldn't quite recognize, someone she couldn't quite place. Her brother. The realization hit her like a blow to the chest. The silence had never been complete. It had been waiting for her, waiting to pull her back into the past. And as she stood there, frozen in place, she heard it clearly, the sound of her brother calling out to her from the depths of the garden, the sound of something trapped. Her breath caught in her throat as the hum began again, and Evelyn realized that this garden, this place, was not just a sanctuary, it was a prison. Evelyn stood frozen in the garden, the whispers still echoing in her mind, the hum of the thorns pressing down on her like a weight. She had never expected the estate to feel like this, alive, unnerving, as though it were watching her. She instinctively stepped back from the thorns of silence, her heart hammering in her chest. As she retreated, the last of the whispers faded, leaving nothing but the eerie quiet once more. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, though she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in the air around her. The house loomed in the distance, dark and still, and yet Evelyn couldn't help but feel a pull towards it, a call to explore further, to understand what was happening. She had always been someone to seek answers, even in the face of fear, even in the face of the truth she didn't want to face. But now, as the silence of the estate enveloped her once more, Evelyn felt a growing unease. Was it her mind playing tricks, or had something truly awakened here? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching from behind her, soft but deliberate. She turned around quickly, expecting to see some figure emerging from the trees or the house, but there was no one there. Instead, standing just inside the garden gate was a woman, older but with an air of quiet confidence. She wore a dark green shawl, and her face was framed by thick, grey-streaked hair. Her eyes, sharp and keen, fixed on Evelyn with an intensity that made Evelyn feel as though the woman could see straight through her. "You're here," the woman said, her voice calm, almost soothing, but there was something in it. Something hidden, a knowing edge that sent a shiver down Evelyn's spine. Evelyn blinked, not sure if she had seen this woman before. "Who are you?" "Lillian Harper," the woman replied with a small, unreadable smile. "Local herbalist. I run the apothecary down in the village. I heard you'd come back to the estate." Evelyn hesitated, unsure of how to respond. She had expected no one to know she was here, certainly not someone who seemed so familiar with the estate. She didn't remember meeting Lillian before, but there was something oddly familiar about her. "You've been to the garden," Lillian continued as though reading Evelyn's thoughts. "I can see it on your face. The thorns of silence. They can be unsettling, can't they?" Her tone was gentle, almost maternal, but Evelyn could hear the subtle weight behind the words, as though Lillian was speaking from experience. Evelyn nodded stiffly, unsure of what to say. "How do you know about them?" she finally asked, her voice small. Lillian's smile deepened, though it wasn't entirely kind. "Oh, I know more about this place than anyone would ever care to admit. The thorns of silence have a way of creeping into your thoughts, into your very soul. You won't forget them, but they will forget you, in time, unless you let them take you. Some people have learned that the hard way." Evelyn shivered, her mind racing with questions. "What do you mean, take you?" Lillian's gaze turned, distant, her eyes narrowing as if seeing something far beyond the estate. "The thorns. They're tied to the land here. Not just the garden, but to everything. The house, the woods, the lake. They were planted long ago by your ancestors, I believe. The ones who lived here before you." She paused as though weighing her words carefully. "But not everything they did was for the good of the world. The thorns were meant to trap something much more than voices." Evelyn felt a pang in her chest, a flicker of dread that threatened to rise within her. "My brother," she whispered, the words escaping her lips before she could stop them. She hadn't spoken his name in years, not aloud, but here in this place it felt as though he had never truly left her. What happened to him? Lillian's eyes softened for a moment, then grew sharp again. "I don't know exactly what happened to your brother, but I know the garden has a way of claiming what it wants. And you're too close to it now. I can see it. It's already starting to pull at you." Evelyn's heart raced. "What do you mean? What's happening to me?" Lillian took a step closer, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't seem afraid of the garden, of the hum that had filled the air earlier. In fact, she seemed oddly at peace with it all, as though she had come to terms with whatever strange force lingered here. "You're hearing the whispers now. You're feeling the pull. It's the garden, yes, but it's also you. The thorns know what you carry. They've always known." Evelyn frowned. "What does that mean?" Lillian hesitated, then glanced down at the garden behind her, the thick tangle of blood-red flowers swaying in the wind. "The garden feeds on more than just guilt, Evelyn. It feeds on grief, on memories, on silence. And it knows you. It knows what you've lost." She met Evelyn's gaze once more, her eyes unreadable. "This place isn't just a garden. It's a reflection of what's inside you." Evelyn felt a chill creep up her spine as the words sank in. The garden was not just a place. It was part of her, part of what she had carried for years. The guilt, the silence, the unspoken words she had buried so deeply that even her own family had long forgotten them. But the garden had not forgotten. It had never forgotten. And now, neither had she. Lillian's eyes softened. "I can help you, Evelyn, but not if you stay here much longer. The garden will take what it wants, and it will never let you leave." She took a step back, as though preparing to leave, but then she hesitated. "There's a book. It's an old family journal kept by one of your ancestors. You'll find it in the house. If you really want to understand what happened here and what's happening to you, you'll need to read it." Evelyn felt the weight of the decision pressing on her, to go into the house, to seek the answers Lillian spoke of. Her mind was racing. She had always wanted to understand the curse, the family's dark past. But this felt different. She had never expected it to be this personal. Lillian gave her a final, knowing look. "I'll leave you to it then. But remember, nothing in this place is ever as it seems. Be careful, Evelyn. The garden is only the beginning." With that, Lillian turned and disappeared into the woods, leaving Evelyn standing alone once more, her heart pounding in her chest. The hum from the garden began again, low and steady, as though calling her back. The thorns were waiting, and Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that they had been waiting for her all along. Evelyn stood motionless at the edge of the garden, staring at the spot where Lillian had disappeared into the woods. The older woman's words hung in the air like a thick fog, pressing in on her thoughts. "The thorns know you. They know what you've lost." How could she be so certain? And what was it that the garden was waiting for? Her eyes flicked back to the blood-red flowers, the petals glistening as though they were alive, pulsing with some unnatural rhythm. The hum had returned, now deeper, more insistent. Evelyn's throat tightened. She had always believed in science. Her work as a botanist had taught her to find logic and explanation in nature. But nothing about this place made sense. Nothing about the thorns of silence made sense. With a sharp breath, she turned away from the garden, pulling her coat tighter around her, trying to shake the feeling that the estate itself was closing in on her. As she made her way back toward the house, a cold gust of wind swept past her, making the trees groan in protest, their limbs creaking like old bones. She had almost reached the door when she heard a rustling behind her. It was not the wind. This sound was too deliberate, too close. Evelyn stopped, her heart skipping a beat. She turned around quickly, expecting to find someone or something there. But the garden was empty. For a moment, everything seemed still. The air was thick with the scent of damp leaves, and the faint rustle of the trees above was the only sound. And yet, something lingered, a sensation she couldn't quite place. It was as though the entire estate were holding its breath, waiting. She took a hesitant step forward, and then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. A figure standing at the garden gate. Finn Coleman. He was leaning against the stone wall, his tall, broad frame outlined against the darkening sky. His eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made Evelyn pause. He looked as if he had been standing there for a while, watching her, though she hadn't noticed his approach. His presence was calm, but there was an unmistakable tension in the way he held himself, as though he were waiting for her to say something or to leave. "You're still here," he said, his voice low but clear, carrying across the distance between them. Evelyn gave a stiff nod, her pulse quickening as she crossed the threshold of the garden. "I'm just trying to get my bearings." She could feel his eyes on her, assessing, as if he could see right through her, to the panic that was beginning to creep up from the pit of her stomach. "You shouldn't be," Finn replied, pushing himself off the stone wall with a slow, deliberate movement. His gaze never wavered from hers. "Not here, not alone." Evelyn blinked, a knot forming in her chest. "What do you mean?" He took a step closer, his boots crunching on the gravel path, but there was a hesitancy in his movements, as if he too were reluctant to step too far into the garden. "The thorns, they..." He paused, searching for the right words. "They're not just plants. They're a part of this place, and this place isn't as empty as it seems." Evelyn frowned. "I don't understand." Finn glanced over his shoulder, as if he were looking to make sure no one else was listening. "You think it's just an old house with a pretty garden? But the estate's been standing for a long time, longer than you might realize. The thorns they're a part of the family's legacy, and not all legacies are meant to be preserved." A chill ran down Evelyn's spine, and she instinctively took a step back, her gaze darting between him and the garden. What are you trying to say? Finn sighed, looking weary, as though he had long ago resigned himself to this conversation. The people who lived here before you, they made a deal, a trade, if you will. The thorns, he gestured toward the twisted flowers, are part of that. They were meant to protect something, or to trap something, depending on how you look at it. Trap what? Evelyn's voice cracked, betraying her growing sense of dread. People, he said bluntly. Voices, memories. It doesn't matter what it is. The garden, it takes what it wants, and it's been fed for generations. Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face. Are you saying my family are responsible for this, for what's happening here? He nodded, the weight of his words sinking into the air between them. It's been going on long before you were born. The thorns have a way of latching onto the ones who come back, the ones who feel they've lost something. Guilt is their favorite food, you know. Evelyn's hands trembled at her sides. She thought of her brother, of his death, of the memories she had tried so desperately to bury. The guilt had always been there, hovering just beneath the surface, a constant companion she could never shake. You're saying they've been waiting for me? Finn's eyes softened, and for a moment, Evelyn saw the sadness there, the same kind of sadness she had felt for years, as if he understood what it was like to be haunted by something you couldn't escape. Not just you, but yes. They know, they can feel what's inside of you. Evelyn swallowed hard. I didn't come here for this. I didn't come here to... She stopped herself, not knowing what to say. What could she say? You need to... Leave, Finn said firmly, stepping closer now. This place, the garden, it's already inside you. It doesn't matter if you try to leave or if you try to bury it again. It won't let you go. A strange silence fell between them, broken only by the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. Evelyn's mind was spinning, the words swirling around her, crashing together in a storm she couldn't control. The garden. It was feeding off her. Of course it was. It had always been feeding off her. That was what Lillian had meant. That was what Finn was warning her about, but she couldn't leave. She couldn't just walk away from the place that had tied her to everything she had lost. I have to understand it, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I have to know what happened. To my brother, I have to know why he's here, why this place, why it's still holding me. Finn shook his head slowly. It's not just about understanding. The thorns won't let you understand. They will twist the truth until it doesn't matter anymore. You'll become part of their story, and once you are, you'll never leave. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest, and for the first time since she had stepped foot on the estate, she felt truly alone. She looked at Finn, at the intensity in his eyes, but there was nothing he could say to make her leave. Not now. I have to stay, she said firmly, her resolve hardening, though doubt gnawed at her from every corner of her mind. I need to face this. I can't run anymore. Finn looked at her for a long moment, then gave a grim nod. Just don't say I didn't warn you. With that, he turned and walked back toward the village, leaving Evelyn standing alone in the garden, the hum of the thorns growing louder around her, as though they were calling her name. And this time, she couldn't ignore them. The garden stretched out before Evelyn like a living memory, twisting and sprawling across the forgotten estate. The thorns of silence stood like sentinels, their blood-red petals catching the dim light of the late afternoon. It felt like a place, suspended between time, where the past and present collided in an uneasy dance, each step leaving an indelible mark. She had come here seeking answers, but as the day began to fade, she found herself retreating into the shadows of doubt. Finn's warning echoed in her mind. Once you are part of their story, you'll never leave. The words felt like an omen, heavy and inescapable. But Evelyn wasn't sure she believed it. She couldn't believe it. She had to understand what had happened here, had to make sense of the memories that plagued her. It was the only way she would ever find peace. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long, stretching shadows over the garden. Evelyn's mind, still racing with the conversation she had had with Finn, drifted back to the house. The estate had once been the pride of her ancestors. She knew that much. But now it stood in ruins, silent, broken, as if it were already a tomb. As she stepped back into the house, the air felt colder, as though the walls themselves were closing in on her. The smell of mildew, of rot, clung to the place, but it wasn't the physical decay that unsettled her. It was the sense that the house had witnessed something terrible. Evelyn moved through the dimly lit hallway, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. The silence was suffocating, and it wasn't just the house that was quiet. Her thoughts, too, seemed muffled, distant. Each room she passed held memories that felt not her own, but that she couldn't quite shake. Faint glimpses of a time long past, images that seemed to dance on the edge of her perception, teasing her. In the old library, dust covered the shelves, and the air felt thick with forgotten knowledge. Books were stacked haphazardly, some resting, in piles, others falling apart from age and neglect. The room had once been full of life, with her ancestors poring over their studies and experiments. But now, it was just a forgotten relic, its secrets buried beneath layers of time. Evelyn moved toward the farthest shelf, where she could just make out the worn spine of a thick leather-bound book, the journal Lillian had mentioned. With trembling hands, she pulled it from the shelf, feeling the weight of it, the musty scent of old paper filling the air. Her fingers brushed over the cover, a chill racing up her spine. She opened the journal slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. The handwriting was faded but still legible, the words scrawled across the pages like frantic thoughts, each entry more disjointed than the last. Her eyes caught on one particular passage, scrawled hastily in the margins. The thorns must never be allowed to grow. They will feed, they will take, they will silence us all. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as she flipped to the next page. The words were no less frantic, filled with the same sense of urgency. We believed we could control them. We were wrong. The thorns are not simply plants. They are a conduit, a connection to something far darker, to silence, to memory. We planted them for protection. But now we know. There is no protection from them. She read on, the words blurring as her mind raced to make sense of it all. Her ancestors had planted the thorns for protection, yes, but they had also been warned. They had known what would happen, known that the thorns would not be tamed, that they would feed on something deeper, something darker. It was no longer just about the garden, it was about what it had become, what it had always been. Evelyn's hands trembled as she turned the page, a new entry catching her eye. The garden is hungry. The voices, the memories, they are nothing but fuel for the thorns. The more they take, the stronger they grow. We fear we are too late. There is no turning back. A sense of dread settled over her, cold and suffocating. Her gaze fell to the next passage, this one written more neatly, as though the writer had regained some measure of control. The final ritual must be performed. We must silence the thorns before they silence us. Her mind raced. A ritual? What kind of ritual could it be, and what was it meant to achieve? The pages were worn thin, and the ink began to fade as Evelyn continued to turn them, desperate for answers. But the last few pages were torn, the words illegible. It was as if the journal had been abandoned mid-thought, its final secrets locked away from her. She slammed the book shut with a sudden force, the sound echoing in the empty library. Her breath came in ragged gasps, the weight of what she had read settling heavily in her chest. The thorns were more than just plants. They were a part of something much larger, something tied to her family's dark past. Her ancestors had known the dangers of the garden, had tried to stop it, but they hadn't. They had failed. Evelyn closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. What had they tried to stop? She didn't know, but she needed to find out. The truth was buried in the soil of the garden, in the land that had borne witness to everything her family had done and failed to do. A sudden rustling sound broke her thoughts. Her heart leapt into her throat as she turned toward the doorway, where a shadow stood, faint, barely visible in the darkening light. The outline of a person, though no one had entered the room. The air felt heavier now, the silence more profound. She could feel the presence in the room with her, something watching, waiting. Her skin prickled with an almost unbearable tension. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain calm. No response, just the sound of her own voice hanging in the air, swallowed by the stillness. The shadow didn't move, didn't speak. But it was there, as real as the chill that had settled in her bones. And in that moment, Evelyn understood. The garden wasn't just a place, it was a presence. It had always been watching, always waiting, waiting for her. She had come seeking peace. But she was beginning to realize that peace was never going to come. Not here, not in Hollowthorne. The garden had made sure of that long ago. As Evelyn turned away from the shadow, her eyes fell on the window where the last light of the day was slipping away. The garden beyond seemed to shift, as if in response to her gaze, the thorns swaying in the wind. And though she didn't know it yet, the garden was calling to her once more. But this time she was listening. Evelyn could feel it now. The pulse of the garden, the thrum of its energy beneath her skin. The thorns of silence were no longer just a curiosity to her. They were a presence, a weight, a dark, watchful force that had always been a part of Hollowthorne, part of her family's legacy, and now part of her. She couldn't escape it, not anymore. Her heart raced as she stepped away from the library, the weight of the journals, revelations hanging over her like an impending storm. The house seemed to stretch on endlessly, each room more suffocating than the last. The air felt colder now, the silence thicker, pressing in on her from all sides. It was as if the house itself was alive, shifting, breathing, with its own dark pulse. It watched her every step, every movement. Evelyn didn't know where to go next. She couldn't stay here, not in this house that felt more like a mausoleum, with each passing hour. But the garden was calling to her. She could feel its hum deep in her chest, vibrating beneath her skin like a distant, forgotten memory. It was both familiar and foreign, a connection she couldn't fully explain but couldn't deny. The thorns were waiting. With a trembling hand, she reached for the door and stepped back into the fading light of the garden. The evening air was heavy with the scent of damp earth, and the garden before her seemed to shimmer with an unnatural stillness. The wind had died down completely, leaving only the soft rustling of leaves in the distance. But even that felt wrong, like a soft whisper, barely audible, calling her name. She stood still for a moment, allowing the silence to settle around her. The garden stretched out before her in a wild tangle of vines, thorns, and flowers. The blood-red petals of the thorns of silence gleamed in the dimming light, their twisted forms undulating in the stillness as though they were alive, breathing, waiting for her. Evelyn could hear it again. The hum. It was faint at first, like the distant murmur of a forgotten conversation, but it grew louder with each passing second. It was a sound she had become accustomed to, but now it no longer felt like a natural part of the world. It was a sound that made her skin crawl, that seemed to reach into the very marrow of her bones. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, The sound stopped. In the heavy, oppressive silence that followed, Evelyn heard something else. A soft whisper, faint but unmistakable. Evelyn. Her name. The voice was familiar, but she couldn't place it. It was deep and smooth, like a memory she couldn't quite recall. She turned quickly, but there was no one there. No shadow, no figure standing in the garden. But the voice had come from somewhere close, just out of reach. Her pulse quickened as she scanned the garden, her eyes darting from the twisted thorns to the darkening trees, but everything remained still. Too still. Evelyn. Again the whisper. Louder this time, and closer. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. Her gaze locked onto one of the thorns of silence, and as she stared at it, the petals seemed to quiver, almost imperceptibly. Was it her imagination? Or had the flower moved? Evelyn. Come closer. The voice wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a call, a beckoning, as though the garden itself was speaking to her, urging her to come closer, to step deeper, into its embrace. Against every instinct in her body, Evelyn felt her legs move. She didn't consciously choose to step forward. It was as if the garden itself was pulling her toward it. Her breath quickened, her hands trembling at her sides. She didn't want to go closer. She didn't want to hear that voice again. But her body moved of its own accord, carrying her toward the center of the garden, where the thorns stood in a tight cluster, their crimson petals glowing softly in the twilight. With each step, the air around her seemed to grow colder, thicker. The hum was back, louder now, like the soft ringing of a bell in the distance. It vibrated through her chest, through her bones. She felt dizzy, disoriented, as if the garden itself was warping her perception. The scent of rotting earth and sweet decay filled the air, growing stronger with each breath she took. Closer. Come closer, the voice coaxed. Evelyn's heart pounded as she stopped just a few feet away from the cluster of thorns. She could feel the pull now, stronger than ever, as if the flowers themselves were alive, reaching out to her with unseen hands. Their petals trembled in the breeze, and she could hear a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like a soft sigh. But it wasn't the wind. The whisper came again, louder this time. You must remember, Evelyn. Remember why you're here. Remember him. Her breath caught in her throat. The voice. It wasn't just speaking to her. It was speaking of her brother, Samuel. Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face. Her thoughts scrambled to make sense of what was happening. This wasn't just a garden. It wasn't just a place. It was feeding off her memories, her grief. It was reaching into her, pulling out her darkest, most buried secrets. Remember him, Evelyn. He's here, waiting. Her vision blurred for a moment, and then everything shifted. The garden before her was no longer just an overgrown, decaying estate. It was a memory, a flash of her childhood, vivid and real. The lake behind the house, Samuel, his laughter echoing in her ears as he splashed in the water, his face alive with joy. And then, just as quickly, the image twisted, and the laughter turned to a scream. She was back at the lake, standing helpless on the shore, watching as her brother struggled against the water. She could see his face, twisted in fear, his mouth opening wide in a silent cry for help. The scene unfolded before her, over and over again, as though the garden had pulled that moment from her mind and replayed it in an endless loop. The memory, the guilt, it was all there, raw, undeniable. He's waiting. The voice whispered again. Come, Evelyn, he's waiting for you. Evelyn snapped back to reality with a sharp gasp, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Her heart raced, thudding painfully in her chest. She was standing at the center of the garden, surrounded by the thorns. The soft hum filled the air, and for a moment everything seemed to be shifting, warping, bending around her. She could feel the pull of the thorns growing stronger, as though they were feeding on her fear, on her memories. The ground beneath her feet trembled just slightly, as if the earth itself was responding to her presence. The hum turned into a low, resonating sound that vibrated through her very core, and the thorns seemed to sway toward her, as if they were alive, as if they were waiting. Evelyn could feel the garden drawing her deeper, pulling her into the heart of the mystery, into the truth of what had happened here. But with every step she took, every inch she moved closer to the center, she could feel her connection to the world outside slipping away, her hold on reality beginning to fade. The thorns of silence were calling her name, and this time she couldn't escape. Evelyn's pulse pounded in her ears as the last echoes of the voice faded into the garden's oppressive hum. The memory of her brother's drowning, his final silent cry, still hung in the air, thick and suffocating. She stood motionless in the center of the garden, surrounded by the thorns, the petals gleaming faintly in the dimming light. The words of the voice, the whispers of the garden, pulsed through her mind, growing louder, insistent, waiting. Future memory, replaying over and over in her mind, was a silent scream. She had never heard Samuel's voice when he was drowning. There had been no cry for help, no gasp for breath. Just the gurgling sound of water swallowing him whole. And the stillness. That terrifying stillness, the silence that had followed his death, had been the very thing that haunted her every night, every waking moment. Her throat tightened, and her eyes burned with unshed tears. She didn't want to face it. She didn't want to confront the truth, the darkness buried beneath the surface. But the garden wasn't letting her go. The thorns were waiting for her to remember, to accept what she had done. Suddenly a sharp, almost metallic sound pierced the thick silence, an unmistakable snap like a twig breaking underfoot. Evelyn's heart skipped in her chest and she spun around quickly, searching the garden for the source of the sound. The wind was still, the air as thick as ever, and yet something had shifted, as if the garden itself had stirred. In the distance, through the tangled thorns and vines, Evelyn saw a shadow move. It was fleeting, barely perceptible, but it was enough to send a chill rippling through her. Her breath caught in her throat. She wasn't alone. The rustling grew louder, closer now, and her gaze locked onto the figure that emerged from the gloom. It was Lillian, stepping out from behind a thick cluster of vines, her movements slow, deliberate. The older woman's face was unreadable, a mask of quiet determination. "You've seen it, haven't you?" Lillian's voice cut through the silence, low and measured, but filled with a quiet urgency. "You've seen what's inside." Evelyn's breath came in shallow gasps as she nodded, unsure of what to say. Her hands trembled as she wiped her face, but the tears wouldn't come. It was as if the very act of crying had been silenced, locked away in the same way her brother's voice had been. Lillian took a step closer, her eyes scanning the garden, the thorns, as though they too were part of her own painful memory. "The garden is more than just a place, Evelyn. It's a vessel, a conduit, a bridge between the living and the dead, between the past and the present. The thorns don't just steal voices, they steal memories. They trap what is left unsaid." Evelyn swallowed hard, the truth of Lillian's words sinking in. She had felt it, the garden's pull. But now, hearing it aloud, she understood. The thorns were feeding off her grief, off her silence. That was why they had called to her, why they had reached into her soul. Her guilt had awakened them. Her memories had fed them. "I didn't come here to be trapped in this place," Evelyn whispered, her voice hoarse, broken. The weight of her guilt was suffocating. She had never asked for this, never wanted the garden to latch onto her. She had only come seeking answers. But what she had found was a nightmare she couldn't escape. "You cannot escape it," Lillian said, her voice softer now, almost mournful. "Not anymore. Not without paying the price." Evelyn's eyes narrowed in confusion. "What price?" Lillian's gaze softened as she stepped forward, her voice barely more than a whisper. "The thorns feed on silence. They thrive on it. But they will only let you go if you offer them something. Something precious. Something that will silence the rest of you." Evelyn felt a shiver run down her spine, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had already sacrificed so much. Her peace, her happiness, her memories. But what could the garden want from her now? What more could it take? Lillian's words hung in the air, thick with implication. "You're bound to this place now. It knows you. It knows your grief. And it will only let you go when it's taken what it needs." Evelyn's eyes widened in realization, but before she could speak, a new voice rang out, sharp, clear and unfamiliar. "Stop talking in riddles." "Lillian." Evelyn spun around, her pulse quickening as another figure emerged from the shadows. It was Finn, his face pale and drawn, his eyes wide with something that looked like both dread and pity. He took a step forward, glancing between Evelyn and Lillian with an air of apprehension. "I warned her," Finn continued, his voice tight with urgency. "I told her this place would take what it wants. But I didn't expect this." Evelyn felt her chest tighten at the sight of him. She had thought she was alone, isolated in the middle of this cursed garden. But here he was, standing between her and the deepening darkness. She didn't know what he knew about the thorns, but his presence felt like a lifeline in the chaos. "Finn," Evelyn started, but her voice trailed off as she realized she didn't know what to say. She had no words for what she was feeling, for what she had seen in the garden. Finn's gaze shifted to Lillian, his expression hardening. "I told you to leave it alone. I told you to stay out of this. But you never listen, do you?" Lillian stood still, her gaze meeting his without flinching. "I was trying to help her." "You should have warned her, Finn. You should have told her the truth." Finn shook his head, his jaw clenched. "The truth is that this place is never done with us. The thorns don't just feed on memories, they feed on loss. And the more you try to outrun it, the deeper it sinks into you." The tension between the two of them was palpable, a quiet storm brewing in the silence. Evelyn could feel it, the weight of their shared history, their silent understanding of what this garden had already taken from them. Lillian's eyes softened as she turned back to Evelyn, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "You don't have much time left. If you want to leave, you have to make a choice, a sacrifice." Evelyn's heart thundered in her chest as she tried to make sense of everything she was hearing. Sacrifice? What kind of choice was she being asked to make? "Before she could speak," Lillian added, "you've already given so much. But the thorns, they won't release you until you give everything." Evelyn's stomach dropped as the full weight of those words hit her. She was trapped, caught in a place that lived and breathed on her grief, on her silence. The truth of her brother's death, her family's dark legacy, was being pulled from her, feeding the garden that was consuming her from the inside out. And now, it seemed, there was only one way out. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned, to Finn, to Lillian, the weight of the decision pressing on her chest. She had always been so sure of herself, of her pursuit of answers, of peace. But now she wasn't so sure she could escape the garden's grasp. What would she have to give up to survive? What price would silence her once and for all? Evelyn stood in the garden, her mind racing. The words Lillian had spoken hung in the air, thick and suffocating. "You've already given so much. But the thorns, they won't release you until you give everything. The idea of a sacrifice was not new, but now, hearing it from Lillian with such quiet certainty, it felt different. It felt inevitable. Her body felt heavier, the weight of the garden pressing down on her like a suffocating fog. She could feel the hum of the thorns vibrating through the soles of her boots, a deep, almost imperceptible frequency that seemed to reach into her very bones. The garden wasn't just alive. It was conscious. It knew her. It knew what she had lost. What price could silence her? She wondered again. What could the garden want from her now? Hadn't she given it everything already? The years of guilt, the constant ache of her brother's death, the silence that had consumed her every waking moment. A cold wind stirred through the garden, making the thorns tremble, their petals fluttering in the fading light. The garden seemed to grow darker as the evening drew near, the shadows lengthening, closing in around her. She turned, trying to pull herself away from the thoughts that threatened to consume her, but the memories wouldn't let her go. It knows me, she thought. It knows what I've buried. Her breath caught as her mind returned to the moment she had tried to bury for so long. That day, the day her brother had died. Evelyn closed her eyes, the memory flooding back with terrifying clarity. It was a bright afternoon when they had gone to the lake. She had been younger then, just a girl, with no real understanding of the consequences of her actions. Samuel had been excited. He was always the adventurous one, the fearless one. He had darted ahead of her, as he always did, eager to race to the water. And she, always the cautious one, had lagged behind, watching him with a mixture of pride and unease. They had been near the old dock, the one that stretched out into the lake, creaking under the weight of years of neglect. Samuel had wanted to jump in, to swim to the farthest point where the water was deepest. He had begged her to join him, to take the plunge with him, but she had hesitated, unsure. She could still hear his voice, bright with that infectious enthusiasm. "Come on, Evie. You can do it." But she had stayed on the shore, watching him. She hadn't been able to bring herself to jump in, to follow him into the dark, cold water. It had been too deep, too dangerous. And then, as she watched, something had gone wrong. Samuel had slipped, lost his footing on the slick rocks, and plunged into the water with a gasp of surprise. He had flailed for a moment, his arms splashing violently, before the water had swallowed him whole. She could still see his face in her mind, wide-eyed, desperate, and most hauntingly silent. No scream, no cry for help, just the water closing over him like a tomb. She had reached out, desperate to help, but she couldn't move. Her feet were stuck to the earth, her body paralyzed, frozen by fear, by the crushing weight of her own hesitation. She had screamed, but no sound had come from her lips. The silence had swallowed it all, and then he was gone. Evelyn opened her eyes, the weight of the memory nearly too much to bear. The cold wind rustled through the garden again, but it felt different this time. Colder, more biting. Her hands trembled as she reached up to wipe away the tears that had begun to spill down her cheeks. But the tears felt hollow, as if they, too, were being swallowed by the silence of the garden. The thorns seemed to lean closer to her, their petals still as red as blood, their twisted forms pulsing softly. She could hear them now, not just the hum, but something deeper, something more unsettling. It was as if the garden was breathing, exhaling in rhythm with her own breath. I killed him. The thought hit her like a blow to the chest, sharp and raw. She had always blamed herself for his death, but now, in the suffocating silence of the garden, it felt like the truth was finally pushing its way to the surface. She had been the one who had stayed behind. She had been the one who had watched him drown. I could have saved him. Her chest tightened, the guilt crashing over her in waves. She had never been able to forgive herself, had never been able to speak the words aloud, had never been able to face the truth of it. But now, in this place, the truth couldn't be hidden any longer. The garden, the thorns, they knew her. They knew what she had done, or what she had failed to do. And then, as if the garden had sensed her inner turmoil, the hum began to change. It was no longer just the soft vibration of the thorns. It became a low, drawn-out note, a voice. Not the voice of Samuel, but the voice of her, echoing in the silence of the garden. Evelyn. It was soft, but it was unmistakable. The voice was her own. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and for a moment, the world seemed to warp, twisting and bending as the garden blurred around her. The thorns seemed to stretch and pulse, their petals twisting like tendrils of a living thing, closing in on her from all sides. The voice called to her again, but it wasn't her own anymore. It was the voice of something else, something from her past. Evelyn, remember. Remember what you did. She stumbled back, her heart hammering in her chest as the garden seemed to shift. She was no longer in the same space, no longer standing at the center of the garden. She was back at the lake, standing on the shore, the cold water rippling in front of her. But this time it was different. She could hear it now, the sound she had always feared. The sound of her brother's voice. Evie. Help me. The words were faint, but they pierced through the fog of the memory, clear as day. Samuel was calling to her, his voice ragged, desperate. But this time, she could hear it. She could hear the cry, the panic in his voice. She hadn't imagined it. The memory shifted again, distorting like a broken film reel, and suddenly she was back in the garden, gasping for air, her heart pounding. The voice was gone, replaced by the hum of the thorns, their petals swaying, reaching toward her. Evelyn stumbled backward, the weight of the truth pressing down on her chest. She had heard his voice. She had heard Samuel's voice all along. The silence, the one she had carried for so long, had never been complete. The garden had been holding onto his voice, and now it had given it back to her. She wasn't sure what to do with it, what it meant, but one thing was clear. The garden was no longer just a reflection of her guilt. It was a place of reckoning, where her past was waiting to be unearthed, and she would have to face it. The truth hit Evelyn with the force of a storm. She had heard Samuel's voice, his real voice, the one she had so longed to hear. It had been trapped in the garden all this time, buried beneath the weight of her own guilt and silence. The realization that the thorns had been holding onto her brother's memory, his last moments, twisted something deep inside her. It felt like a door had been unlocked, but instead of relief, the flood of emotions that rushed in only left her, feeling more lost, more hopeless. The garden seemed to grow darker, the once familiar red petals of the thorns now a menacing shade of black in the fading light. The hum was louder now, a deep, resonating thrum that reverberated through her body. It wasn't just the thorns anymore. This place, the very air, felt charged, as if the land itself had awakened, responding to her unraveling. She backed away from the garden, her heart racing. She needed to get out. But as she turned, she saw Finn standing at the edge of the garden, his face drawn and tired, his eyes full of something she hadn't seen before. A mix of regret and something darker, something like fear. "You've heard it, haven't you?" Finn's voice was low, heavy with meaning. "You've heard his voice." Evelyn stopped in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't expected him to be here, not now, not after everything. And yet there he was, standing like a shadow between her and the way out. "How long?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How long have you known about this place?" About the thorns? Finn's eyes darted to the garden, then back to her. He didn't answer immediately, as if weighing his words carefully. Finally, he exhaled, his shoulders slumping. Longer than you think. Evelyn stared at him, trying to piece together what he was saying. Why didn't you warn me? Why didn't you tell me about the garden's hold over me? Finn's expression hardened. Because I didn't want you to know the truth. I didn't want you to see what was coming. I thought if you stayed away, if you didn't uncover the past, maybe the garden would let you go. Maybe it would leave you alone. Evelyn's mind reeled, struggling to make sense of his words. Leave me alone. You mean you knew all along what the garden wanted? And you didn't stop me? You didn't help me? I didn't know how to help you, Finn muttered, his voice cracking under the weight of his confession. I thought, if I kept my distance, if I didn't get involved, you'd get out of here unscathed. But I should have known better. I should have warned you. But I didn't. And now, his words trailed off, a heavy silence filling the space between them. Evelyn stepped closer, her gaze hardening as she took in his defeated posture. Now what? You think you can fix this? You think you can undo what you've done? Finn flinched, but there was something in his eyes that betrayed the depth of his guilt. No, he said quietly, I can't undo it. But I can help you understand it. Help you understand why the garden has always been like this. Why it calls to you, to all of us. Evelyn's chest tightened. She felt the familiar pull of the garden at the back of her mind, the hum still vibrating deep within her bones. She didn't want to understand. She didn't want to know the full extent of what she had walked into. All she wanted was to escape, to run away and never look back. But she knew it wasn't that simple. Why didn't you tell me about the ritual? She asked, her voice cutting through the tension. The one that your family was involved in. The one that tied us all to the thorns. Finn's face went pale at the mention of the ritual. He ran a hand through his hair, the weight of it all crashing down on him. It wasn't my secret to tell. Not then. My family. They tried to bury it. They tried to forget. But the garden never lets you forget. Evelyn could feel the anger rising within her, a bitter tide that threatened to overwhelm her. But you knew what was happening, and you let me walk right into it. I didn't want you to suffer like I have, Finn said, his voice strained. I didn't want you to end up like me, trapped in this place, trapped by the memories of what your family did. I tried to keep you away from it. You think I wanted to come back here? Evelyn snapped, her hands clenched into fists. You think I came here out of some twisted desire to relive the past? I came here because I needed answers, because I've been suffering. I've been living in the shadow of my brother's death for years. Finn's eyes softened with something like regret. I know you have, but you're not the only one who's been suffering. My family, they've been tied to this place, to the garden, for generations. And it's not just guilt that the thorns feed on, it's secrets too. Your family, my family, we're all tangled up in this. Evelyn shook her head, stepping away from him, as though she couldn't bear to be this close to him anymore. You could have warned me. You could have told me what you knew. Instead, you let me fall into the same trap your family put me in. Finn opened his mouth to speak, but the words seemed to die in his throat. There was nothing he could say to fix this, nothing he could say to undo the damage. The betrayal was there, raw and bleeding in the space between them. I didn't want this for you, Evelyn, Finn said, his voice low, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Regret, maybe, or something darker. But it's too late now. Evelyn's breath hitched, the weight of his words sinking in. She had come here looking for answers, and instead, she had uncovered more than she ever wanted to know. She had discovered the curse, the twisted ritual that had bound their families to the garden. And now, the truth of her brother's death was tangled up in it, just like everything else. "You've already given everything," Finn whispered, as if reading her mind. "The thorns have fed on your grief, your silence, your memories. The only question now is how much more you're willing to lose." Evelyn stared at him, her chest tight with fear and anger. How much more could she lose? The garden was pulling at her, the thorns reaching out with invisible hands, feeding off her confusion, her sorrow. She could feel them drawing closer, their presence growing heavier, like a storm on the horizon. And Finn, he was just another piece of the puzzle, another thread in the web of lies and guilt that had ensnared her, another betrayal in a world that seemed to be made entirely of betrayal. "I'll find my own way out," Evelyn said, her voice trembling with a mixture of defiance and exhaustion. She turned her back on him and walked away, the hum of the garden growing louder, its pull stronger. But this time she didn't turn back. Not for Finn, not for anyone. She was in this alone now. Evelyn's footsteps echoed in the garden as she walked away from Finn, her heart pounding in her chest. The garden felt alive, its hum vibrating through the earth beneath her boots, a constant reminder that there was no escape from what had begun. Her mind was spinning, still caught in the aftermath of the confrontation. The truth about her brother's death, the curse tied to her family, Finn's betrayal. It all tangled together in her thoughts like the vines that wrapped around the garden. She couldn't untangle it. She couldn't breathe. She pushed through. The thorns, the sharp tips scraping at her skin. But it didn't matter. Pain was just another sensation to bury beneath the weight of her grief. She was walking toward something, toward the answer she had come here for. But it felt as if the very ground beneath her was shifting, drawing her deeper into the garden's grasp. The garden, she realized, wasn't just calling her name. It was taking hold of her. The thorns of silence were feeding on her emotions, on her vulnerability, and they were growing stronger, their reach expanding. She felt it in the way the wind shifted, in the way the shadows seemed to lengthen as though time itself was warping in the garden's presence. Her body was moving, but she wasn't in control. The garden was. She reached the center of the garden, standing in the place where the thorns grew thickest. The air here was heavy, almost suffocating, and the hum was deafening. She closed her eyes, trying to block it out, but the sound was inside her head, in her very bones, vibrating through her. She pressed her hands to her ears, but it only intensified. "Remember him." The voice again, soft but insistent, like a whispering memory clawing at her mind. She tried to push it away, but the images flooded in, unbidden. Samuel's face, pale and terrified as he slipped beneath the water, his hands reaching up to her, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. "Why didn't you help me?" The memory seemed to scream. But it wasn't just his voice. Her own voice echoed in her mind, the one she had silenced for so long, the one that had been trapped alongside her brother's death. "Why didn't you save him?" The question cut through her like a knife, the sharpness of it almost physical. She gasped, feeling the air grow heavier around her. The thorns were closing in. She was being suffocated by the weight of it all. The guilt, the grief, the memories, she couldn't outrun them. They were pulling her down into the depths of the garden, into the darkness that had already consumed her. And then, suddenly, there was a snap. The sound was like a crack in the air, a sharp, piercing noise that split through the hum of the thorns, breaking the weight of silence that had settled over her. Evelyn froze. For a moment, there was nothing but the echo of the crack ringing in her ears. And then, she heard it again. This time it was a voice. "Evelyn." The voice was low, strained. It was a whisper that clawed its way out of the silence, and as soon as Evelyn heard it, she knew her mother. She turned quickly, her breath catching in her throat. Standing at the edge of the garden, half hidden in the shadows, was Margaret Hayes. Her face was pale, her features gaunt, as if she had been living in the same suffocating silence for years. Her eyes were wide with a strange mixture of fear and something else, something more fragile, more broken than Evelyn had ever seen before. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. "Mom?" Her voice cracked, torn between disbelief and the overwhelming urge to run. Margaret's eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment there was nothing but the weight of the years that had passed since they last spoke. The silence between them stretched long and uncomfortable, but it wasn't just the absence of sound that haunted Evelyn, it was the weight of it. The years of unanswered questions, the years of not knowing why her mother had retreated into the silence after Samuel's death, why she had shut herself off from the world, from Evelyn. Margaret stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "None of us should have ever come back to this place." Evelyn swallowed, the words hanging in the air like a thick fog. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" "I had to come here. I needed answers. You left me with nothing." Margaret's eyes darkened. "I didn't leave you. I protected you. You don't understand. I had no choice." Her voice faltered, and for a moment she seemed to struggle against something inside her. "It was all part of the deal," she muttered, almost to herself. "We thought we could control it. We thought we could silence the garden, but it always comes back. It always takes." Evelyn took a step forward, her eyes narrowing. "What do you mean, the deal? What did you do, Mom? What did you all do?" Margaret flinched, her hand shaking as she reached out to touch the air in front of her, as though trying to hold back something. "We tried to silence it, to stop it. We made a pact, a ritual." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "But it wasn't enough. The thorns, they were never meant to be controlled. And you were always going to be part of it, Evelyn. The garden knew you. It knew what you were carrying." Evelyn's heart thudded painfully in her chest. The words were like a punch to the gut, the truth she had been avoiding for so long crashing down on her. "You knew," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You knew what was going to happen to me." Margaret nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I knew you'd be the one to break it. I knew the garden would come for you. It always comes for the ones who are silent, and you never spoke of it. You carried the guilt, the grief, and the garden fed on it." The weight of her mother's words pressed down on Evelyn. She could feel the ground beneath her feet shift, the thorns growing taller, their sharp edges threatening to pierce her. The garden was no longer a distant force. It was part of her, part of the darkness that had been buried for so long. "Why didn't you stop it?" Evelyn's voice was a harsh whisper. "Why didn't you stop us from coming back here?" Margaret's eyes softened with regret. "I thought I could protect you by staying silent. I thought if I left, if I didn't speak, I could shield you from the curse. But I was wrong. It was never about silence. It was about sacrifice." Evelyn's heart stilled as she realized the full weight of her mother's words. The sacrifice wasn't just about the family's pact. It was about her. Her brother had been the first. But Evelyn, she had always been the one meant to complete the ritual. The garden had been waiting for her, waiting for the final piece to fall into place. She stepped back, her body shaking as the realization hit her. The garden wasn't just a place of memories. It was a prison, built on the very silence that had consumed her family. And now, it had her. There was no escaping it. "Do you understand now?" Margaret's voice was barely a breath, filled with sorrow. It's too late for you, Evelyn. The thorns will take you, just as they've taken all of us. Evelyn shook her head, her breath coming in shallow gasps. No. She backed away, her chest tight with panic. I won't let it. I won't let it take me. But as she turned to flee, the garden closed in around her. The thorns reached up, their long, twisted stems creeping toward her, their petals opening like hungry mouths. The hum grew louder, and the voice, Samuel's voice, her own voice, echoed through the garden. Evelyn, come closer. And this time, Evelyn knew she had no choice. Evelyn stumbled back, her heart racing, as the thorns of silence pressed in around her. The hum, once a low vibration, was now a cacophony of voices, her brother's voice, her own, and others, all mingling together in an impossible chorus that reverberated through her very bones. The garden felt alive, its pulse in sync with her own frantic heartbeat. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, closing in like hands reaching for her, pulling her deeper into the suffocating grasp of the garden. She couldn't breathe. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and her lungs burned with every gasping breath she took. She felt the weight of her mother's words pressing down on her, sinking into her chest, twisting her gut. The thorns will take you. The words reverberated in her mind like an ancient chant, a warning that had now become an inevitability. But there was something else, something darker lurking in the air. A shift. The garden seemed to pulse, its very essence vibrating in response to her panic, her guilt, and the emotions she had buried for so long. The thorns, their petals stretching toward her, glowed with a faint otherworldly light, red as blood, black as night. She reached out to steady herself, but as her fingers brushed the nearest stem, she felt it, a sharp sting. The pain was immediate and searing, like fire running through her veins. She gasped, pulling her hand away, but the thorn's thorn had already pierced her skin. For a moment, she felt as if the garden itself had drawn blood from her, had marked her. The feeling was unlike anything she had ever experienced, intimate, cruel, as if the garden knew her, knew what it had taken from her, and was now claiming its price. For a heartbeat, she thought she might collapse, that she might give in to the darkness that was swallowing her. But then, something impossible happened. The world around her flickered. It was subtle at first, a brief flicker in the light, like a candle flame quivering in the wind. Then the ground beneath her feet seemed to ripple, the garden shifting in a way that defied logic. The thorns, once so still, began to move. The petals shuddered, vibrating as though they were alive, as though the entire garden were a living, breathing creature. The hum grew louder, the voices more insistent, drowning her in their demands. And then there was a crack. It was a sudden sound, sharp and thunderous, as though the very earth beneath her had split open. The sky above her darkened, swirling, with dark clouds that seemed to form a perfect circle above the garden. The thorns recoiled, their petals shrinking back as though afraid of what was about to unfold. Evelyn gasped, her eyes wide in terror. She felt the ground shift beneath her, as though the very soil was alive, as if it were moving, rearranging itself. The garden, the entire garden, seemed to be writhing, its vines twisting and snapping like serpents. And then, in the center of the garden, something began to rise. It was a figure, a shadowy form, distorted and shifting. At first it was nothing more than a blur, but as it rose higher it began to take shape. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as she saw the outline of a figure, familiar but wrong. The edges of the figure blurred in and out of focus like a mirage, but it was unmistakable. It was Samuel, but not Samuel. The figure that rose from the garden was distorted, twisted like a ghost trapped between worlds. His features were barely recognizable, his body too thin, his face contorted in a way that made Evelyn's heart seize in her chest. His eyes, wide and unblinking, stared at her with an intensity that sent a chill through her entire being. And his mouth was open, but no sound came out. The silence that had plagued her for so long was now alive in him, feeding off him. His presence was a grotesque reflection of the boy she had once known, the boy she had failed to save. "Evelyn," the voice whispered again. But it was not his voice. It was distorted, a hollow, gurgling echo that seemed to come from deep within the earth. The words reverberated in her mind, shaking her to her core. Evelyn stumbled backward, her breath ragged as she took in the impossible sight before her. The garden had always been alive, but now it had manifested something more, something alive and dead all at once. Her brother, or whatever was left of him, stood before her, trapped in the garden's grip. "Help me," the distorted voice rasped. "Save me, Evelyn." But Evelyn knew. This wasn't Samuel. Not anymore. This was the garden's creation. The thorns had twisted him, had made him into something else. This was no longer the boy she had known. This was a reflection of her guilt, her failure to act, to save him. This was a manifestation of everything she had buried, everything she had left unspoken. Evelyn's hand shook, and she backed away from the figure. The words that she had heard in her dreams, the ones she had pushed away for so long, came flooding back. "You didn't save him, Evelyn. You didn't save him." The thorns pulsed again, the hum growing louder, as if the garden itself was responding to the figure's presence. The air around her thickened, the weight of it pressing down on her chest, making it harder to breathe. She could feel the darkness closing in, feel the ground beneath her feet crackling with energy, as though the garden itself was on the verge of consuming everything. Her legs shook, her body trembling with fear and confusion. She wanted to run, to escape, but she knew there was nowhere to run. The garden knew her. It had always known her. It had been waiting for her to come back, waiting for her to face the truth. The thorns had taken her brother. The garden had stolen his voice, and now it was asking for hers. A part of her wanted to scream, wanted to shout at the figure that stood before her, demanding answers, demanding release. But another part of her, the part that had always been silenced, that part that had hidden in the shadows of guilt, knew the truth. She was part of it. She had always been part of it. The figure of Samuel, her brother, or what was left of him, stared at her with pleading eyes. And the garden whispered once more, "Evelyn, help him. Help yourself." And in that moment, Evelyn understood. There was no escape from the garden's grasp. It had been feeding on her guilt, on her silence, on her memories, and now it was asking for the final price. She had to make a choice. But what could she sacrifice to end it? Evelyn stood frozen in the garden, her heart thundering in her chest, as the impossible figure of her brother, Samuel, continued to loom before her. His distorted, ghostly form twisted in and out of focus, a horrible reflection of the boy she had lost. His face, once full of life and laughter, was now twisted, pale, and contorted in a way that made Evelyn's stomach churn. The garden had claimed him, just as it had claimed so much else. Her hands shook as she struggled to breathe, the weight of the realization pressing down on her. The thorns of silence, once just a strange and sinister part of the hollow thorn estate, were no longer an abstract curse. They were now a presence. The garden itself had awakened, and its reach extended into her very soul. The garden had taken her brother's voice, his final moments, and had twisted them into something grotesque, something far more sinister than she could have imagined. "Evelyn, you left me," the voice rasped, distorted and faint, barely audible over the hum of the thorns. It was his voice, but it wasn't. It was a hollow echo, filled with an unearthly resonance that made Evelyn's skin crawl. "Why didn't you help me? Why didn't you save me?" She pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was impossible. The voice reverberated in her mind, in her chest, in her very bones. It was a weight she couldn't shake. A question that had been haunting her for years. The garden seemed to close in on her, the thorn's petals trembling as if responding to her emotional turmoil. She could feel the pulse of the garden deep beneath her feet, vibrating through her body, and she knew it wasn't just a part of the estate anymore. It was a part of her, feeding off her grief, her guilt, her silence. It had been waiting for this moment, this reckoning. Tears blurred Evelyn's vision as she stepped back, her knees trembling beneath her. She could feel the weight of her brother's death pressing down on her, suffocating her. His final moments were here, in the garden. In the silence that had consumed her for so long, his voice was trapped here just as hers had been, locked away, feeding the garden. But she couldn't. "Stay here." Not like this. She couldn't face the pain, the guilt, the truth of what she had done, what she had failed to do. "You can't run from this, Evelyn," the voice whispered again, this time not from Samuel, but from the garden itself. The sound was a low murmur, reverberating through the roots of the thorns, through the very soil beneath her feet. "You can't escape what you've become." The words hit her like a physical blow. Her body shook violently as the garden seemed to pulse around her, feeding off her fear, her guilt. She could feel it, a sharp prickling sensation in her fingertips, the same sensation she had felt when the thorns had first pricked her hand. The garden was alive, alive with the power of her grief, of her silence, and it was growing stronger with each passing second. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, the vibrations growing stronger. The thorns seemed to stretch upward, their twisted stems writhing like serpents, their blood-red petals opening wider as if they were hungry. Hungry for her. Evelyn's chest tightened as she realized the truth. She had been feeding the garden all this time. It wasn't just the past that haunted her, it was the guilt. The silence she had carried for so long. The thorns had fed on it, and they had grown stronger with every passing year. And now, they were asking for more. "Evelyn, help me," the voice of Samuel pleaded again, softer this time, almost a whisper. "You can save me. You can fix this. You have to." Evelyn's head spun as she looked at the twisted figure of her brother. Her heart ached with a deep, primal sorrow, but she knew now. This wasn't her brother, not anymore. This was the garden, pulling at her, forcing her to confront what she had tried so hard to bury. Her chest constricted as she forced herself to turn away from the figure, away from the garden. She needed to escape. She couldn't stay here, not with the thorns feeding off her memories, off her emotions. She could feel the weight of it, the suffocating pull growing stronger like a tide that threatened to drag her under. But as she turned to leave, a new, sharper sensation hit her. The air around her seemed to crackle with energy, and her legs buckled beneath her. She gasped for air, but the world around her began to blur, the garden's hum growing deafening. Her vision swam with dark spots, and her limbs felt like lead. She staggered forward, but her feet felt as though they were sinking into the earth. The garden, no, the thorns, were pulling at her, binding her to the ground. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. In the distance, she saw something shift. It was a figure, emerging from the shadows of the garden, moving toward her with slow, deliberate steps. It was Lillian, but as she drew closer, Evelyn saw the truth. Lillian wasn't walking, she was being pulled. Her body was moving unnaturally, her limbs stiff, as if some invisible force were dragging her across the ground. Her eyes were wide with fear, her mouth opening and closing as though she were trying to speak. but no sound came out. The thorns, Evelyn realized, had claimed Lillian too. They were feeding on her just as they had fed on her, just as they had fed on Samuel. Lillian's body jerked to a halt just a few feet away from Evelyn, and she stared at her with wide, desperate eyes. Her lips moved again, but Evelyn couldn't hear her words. She reached out a hand toward Lillian, but the closer she got, the farther Lillian seemed to pull away. A sharp, guttural scream tore from Lillian's throat, but the sound was lost to the air, swallowed by the thorn's hum. It was a sound that sent a chill down Evelyn's spine, a cry of agony that seemed to reverberate in the very ground beneath her. And then it happened. The thorns, those twisted plants that had once seemed so simple, so distant, began to grow faster, stronger. The ground cracked open, vines twisting upward, their sharp thorns lashing out like tendrils, snaring Lillian in their grasp. Evelyn froze, her heart caught in her throat. Lillian's body jerked violently, her hands clawing at the thorns that had wrapped around her. The woman's eyes locked onto Evelyn's with an expression of pure terror, and in that moment Evelyn knew. Lillian wasn't just a victim of the thorns. She had helped them grow. She had fed them. She had been part of it all along, just as much as Evelyn had been. The garden had consumed her, just as it was consuming everyone who came near. Lillian's body went limp, her scream dying in her throat, as the thorns pulled her into the earth, her form disappearing into the soil like a root, taking root in the darkness. Evelyn's breath came in ragged gasps, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She turned away from the spot where Lillian had disappeared, her mind reeling from the sight. The garden had taken her. It had taken her, and it was still hungry. The garden's hum grew louder, the voices more insistent. "Evelyn, you are next." Evelyn turned and ran. There was no more time for hesitation. She had seen enough. The thorns had claimed Lillian. They had claimed Samuel. And now they were coming for her. But this time, there would be no running, no escape. Evelyn's footsteps faltered as she stumbled through the garden, the weight of what she had just witnessed pressing down on her like a suffocating cloud. The thorns of silence had claimed Lillian. They had consumed her, just as they had her brother. The garden had shown her the true cost of the curse, of the pact that her family had made so long ago. It was more than a place of sorrow and grief. It was a ravenous thing, a hungry entity that had fed on generations of silence, guilt, and loss. Evelyn's pulse raced in her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she sprinted toward the edge of the garden, her feet tripping over the uneven ground. She didn't dare stop, didn't dare look back at the spot where Lillian had vanished beneath the earth, swallowed by the thorns. The image was burned into her mind, a grotesque reminder of what awaited her if she didn't escape. The hum of the garden continued to pound in her ears, like the beating of a heart that wasn't her own. But then, just as she neared the edge of the garden, she heard it. A voice. "Evelyn, stop!" The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was Finn. He was standing in the path ahead of her, blocking her way, his face pale and drawn, his eyes wide with something she couldn't quite place, something like regret mixed with fear. He looked at her with a strange, almost apologetic expression, as if he were a stranger trying to understand what had become of them both. "Move," Evelyn spat, her voice hoarse with panic. She didn't want to face him, not now, not after everything. She couldn't. She couldn't bear to hear any more explanations, any more lies. But Finn didn't move. He took a step closer to her, his eyes softening with what seemed like desperation. "I never wanted this for you, Evelyn," he said quietly, his voice trembling. "I didn't know the garden would do this. I didn't know it would consume everything. Everyone." Evelyn's hands clenched into fists, and she took a step back, her breath hitching in her throat. You didn't know. You knew. You knew what was happening. You knew what this place would do to me. You knew what the garden would take. Her voice cracked, the accusation burning through her like acid. She could feel the weight of it, the crushing betrayal. Finn opened his mouth, but no words came out. His face twisted with anguish, as if he was struggling against something deep inside him, something he couldn't control. He stopped himself, shaking his head. I didn't want you to see it. I thought if you stayed away, if you never came back, you'd be safe. Evelyn's anger flared, hot and fierce, pushing the fear away, if only for a moment. Safe, she shouted, her voice echoing through the garden. You thought you could protect me by keeping me in the dark, by letting me live in this lie. You let me come here. You let me face this, face the truth. And now, look what's happened. She was trembling now, her voice raw with emotion, with the weight of years spent in silence. Lillian's gone. Samuel's gone. I'm gone. Finn's eyes filled with tears, and he stepped forward again, reaching out to her. Please, Evelyn, you don't understand. It's not just the thorns. It's the whole estate. It's your family, the garden. It feeds on more than just silence. It feeds on memories. It takes everything from us. I couldn't stop it. But I tried to keep you from it. I tried to protect you. Evelyn shook her head, stepping back further. Protect me? You think this was about protecting me? You let the garden feed on us? You let it tear us apart. You let me believe I could escape. Her voice faltered as the pain in her chest surged, threatening to swallow her whole. You never told me what your family did. You never told me how deep this curse runs. You never told me the truth. Finn's face twisted with guilt, but it wasn't just guilt. There was something else in his eyes now, something darker. You don't understand, he whispered, his voice trembling. I didn't just hide the truth from you to protect you. I hid it because my family made a choice too. We made a choice to live, to survive. We made a deal with the garden, and we thought it would be enough to keep us safe. He paused, his voice cracking. But it wasn't. The garden never lets go. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat and her heart stopped for a moment. What do you mean? Her voice was barely a whisper. What did your family do? Finn hesitated, looking down at the ground as though struggling to find the right words. Then, slowly, his eyes met hers, and his voice dropped to a whisper. We offered a sacrifice. His words hung in the air like a death sentence. The world around Evelyn seemed to collapse inward, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. The weight of his words crushed her chest. A sacrifice, she repeated, her voice trembling. What kind of sacrifice? Finn's eyes were haunted, his face pale and drawn. The first sacrifice was a child from each generation of the family, a life given to the garden to keep it at bay, to make sure it didn't claim us. But over time, the sacrifice became more. It became more than just a life. It became a choice to keep feeding the garden, to keep feeding the curse. He shook his head, his voice faltering. We thought we could control it, but we were wrong. It was never about control. It was about survival. Evelyn took a step back, her body trembling as she tried to process his words. You sacrificed children, she whispered, horrified. You did this. You let the garden take children. And you didn't tell me. You didn't warn me. You let me walk into this, into a family bound by blood and sacrifice. Her breath came in ragged gasps, the truth settling over her like a heavy shroud. I'm a part of it. I'm part of that sacrifice, Finn's expression twisted with pain. I didn't want to tell you, Evelyn. I didn't want to drag you into it, but I was wrong. I should have warned you. I should have told you everything." He stepped closer, but Evelyn backed away, shaking her head. She couldn't bear to hear any more of his apologies. "I didn't come here to learn about your family's sins," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I came here to find peace. To end the curse." Finn's face crumpled in regret. "I never wanted this to happen to you. I never wanted you to get caught in this web. But the garden, it doesn't let you go. It has us all." Evelyn felt the weight of his words sink into her, the truth of what he had said settling deep inside her soul. The garden hadn't just claimed Lillian. It hadn't just twisted Samuel's memory, it had claimed Finn too. He had been caught in the garden's grip, just like her. Evelyn's breath came in shallow, quick gasps as she turned away, her mind reeling. She could feel the garden pressing in on her, its pulse, its hum, its whispers growing louder. She didn't know what to believe anymore. She didn't know who to trust. But one thing was clear. The garden would never let her go. Not now. Not ever. And the worst part was, she didn't know if she could escape it either. Still here? Brave. Or maybe you just like the feeling of being watched. Like, subscribe, and drop your time and location in the comments, so we know who's still out there. Now breathe slow. The worst is coming. The night was thick with tension. Evelyn had retreated to the abandoned house, finding herself aimlessly wandering through its empty, hollowed halls, the weight of Finn's confession and Lillian's disappearance heavy on her shoulders. The garden had claimed another, and though she had run from it, she knew the truth. The garden's grasp wasn't something you could outrun. It followed you. It waited for you, feeding off your guilt, your fear, your silence. Her footsteps echoed. In the empty house, a hollow sound that seemed to reverberate through the walls, mingling with the unnatural hum of the garden outside. The air inside felt stale, suffocating, as though the house itself was trying to trap her. The walls closed in, the silence became oppressive, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer, darker, as if they were pulling at her. It had been hours since she last stepped foot into the garden, but the images from earlier, the grotesque manifestation of her brother Lillian's horrifying fate, would not leave her. They lingered, filling her mind like a suffocating fog. The guilt, the betrayal, the memories of Samuel's drowning. All of it played over and over again in her mind, like a recording she couldn't escape. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The walls of the house seemed to shift with every passing moment, their silence growing louder, more insistent. She tried to sit still, to calm her racing thoughts, but it was impossible. The garden was calling to her again. She thought about the choice Finn had given her, the choice to remain silent, to hide, to walk away from the truth. She had tried to run, but every corner she turned, the garden was there, lurking just beyond the edge of her perception, waiting to claim her. With a sharp breath, she closed her eyes, willing herself to sleep. Perhaps the dreams would offer some relief. Perhaps they would offer an escape. But deep down, she knew it wasn't an escape she needed. It was answers. It was closure. As her body settled into the worn armchair, her eyes fluttered shut, and the world around her began to melt into the darkness of sleep. But the moment her eyes closed, the dream began. She was standing at the edge of the lake again. It was the same place where it had all happened, where Samuel had slipped into the water and disappeared. But now, the lake was still, silent. The air was heavy with a thick fog that clung to her skin, suffocating her. The water was dark, a deep, unsettling black, and the sky above was overcast, casting an eerie pallor over everything. She could hear something in the distance, Someone calling her name. Evelyn. It was Samuel's voice. She could hear it clearly, despite the oppressive silence. It was soft at first, like a whisper on the wind, and then louder, more desperate, as if it were coming from beneath the water. Evelyn, help me. She took a step forward, her body moving on its own, as if pulled by an invisible force. Her feet sank into the soft, wet earth as she approached the water. The fog seemed to part before her, but the air was thick with the stench of decay, as if the lake itself had been tainted by something ancient and wrong. And then, from the depths of the water, Samuel's face appeared. His eyes were wide with fear, his face pale and twisted, his mouth opening and closing as though he were trying to speak, but no sound came. The water surged around him, pulling him deeper into the dark depths, but he was still reaching for her. His hands were outstretched, his expression pleading. "Save me." Evelyn. Her heart pounded as she reached out, her body trembling with the effort. She was so close to him, but she couldn't reach him. The water pulled him further, down, the blackness swallowing him whole. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. Her voice was lost in the silence, just as it had been that day. She reached for him, desperate, but the water closed in around her, cold and unforgiving. "Save me, Evelyn." She felt herself sinking, the weight of the water pressing down on her chest, and then everything went black. Evelyn awoke with a sharp gasp, her breath catching in her throat. The remnants of the dream still lingered in her mind. The images of the lake, Samuel's face, the suffocating silence that had followed him into the water. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and her body was drenched in cold sweat. The weight of the dream was still pressing down on her, and for a moment she wasn't sure if she was still trapped in it. She sat up, her hands trembling as she wiped the sweat from her forehead. The house around her was silent, its emptiness suffocating. But in the silence, she could hear it, the hum of the thorns, faint but unmistakable, vibrating through the air. The garden was still there, still calling to her, and for the first time Evelyn realized something. She wasn't just trapped by her memories. She wasn't just trapped by the guilt. She was trapped by the garden. It had been feeding on her fear, on her sorrow, on her silence. It had been waiting for her to remember, waiting for her to face the truth. The dream had shown her what she had known all along. The water that had swallowed Samuel was not just the lake. It was the garden. The silence that had haunted her since that day was not just the result of grief. It was the result of the thorns, the curse that had been passed down through her family, a curse that fed on the unspoken, the unresolved. The garden had claimed her brother. It had claimed Lillian, and now it was coming for her. But Evelyn knew in that moment that there was no escape from the garden. There was no running from the truth. The only way out now was to face it. The morning after the dream, Evelyn could hardly bring herself to move. Her body felt heavy, weighed down by the crushing gravity of what had been revealed to her in the darkness of sleep. The garden had taken so much already. The voices, the memories, her brother Lillian, and the trust she had once had in Finn. It was all slipping away, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the echo of the past and the thorns that reached for her. She sat in the old chair by the fireplace, staring at the dying embers, her mind reeling. The garden had shown her the lake, had shown her Samuel, had shown her the truth in the silence. The thorns of silence didn't just feed on guilt and grief, they fed on trust too. And that was the most insidious part of it. The thing that kept her trapped in this suffocating web. Finn had known. He had known everything about the curse, about the pact, about the thorns, and yet he had allowed her to stumble into it blindly, just as her family had. They had all allowed it, fed it, kept it going in the hopes that silence could protect them. But it was never silence that had protected them. It was deception. It was betrayal. Evelyn's hands trembled as she pressed them against her forehead, trying to shake away the mounting sense of dread. Finn had tried to protect her, or so he said, but it didn't matter anymore. It didn't change the fact that he had kept the truth from her, that he had let her face this curse without telling her what it truly was. She stood slowly, pushing herself out of the chair, the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her every step. She had to go back to the garden. She had to face it, face whatever was left of the truth. She couldn't keep running. The house felt more oppressive with every step she took, the walls closing in around her, the silence so thick it felt like a physical barrier. The garden was calling to her, its hum reverberating in the air, deep and unrelenting. She could feel the pull of it in her bones. It was hungry, just as it had always been. When she reached the door, she hesitated. She could almost hear Finn's voice in her mind, pleading with her to stay, to leave this place behind, to forget about the garden and the curse. He had warned her about the consequences, about the price of uncovering the truth. But in the end, it didn't matter. She had already crossed the threshold. There was no going back now. She stepped outside, her breath visible in the cold air. The garden lay ahead of her, dark and foreboding, its twisted thorns reaching out like skeletal hands. The light of day was fading, the shadows growing longer, and Evelyn could almost swear she saw something move within the garden's depths. The garden was alive, watching her, waiting for her to make her move. But this time, Evelyn wasn't afraid. The fear that had once paralyzed her was gone. What she felt now was something different, something colder, sharper. It was the recognition of betrayal. As she moved toward the garden, the hum grew louder, filling the air around her. It was not the hum she had heard before. It was different, lower, deeper, as though the garden itself was speaking to her, calling her name with an unmistakable urgency. The thorns seemed to pulse in the fading light, their petals fluttering with a strange rhythm. Evelyn reached out a hand, and the moment her fingers brushed the closest thorn, the hum stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. The air felt thick, heavy with anticipation. Then, from the depths of the garden, there came a sound, a creaking, groaning noise as if something deep within the earth was shifting. The ground beneath Evelyn's feet trembled. She looked down, her pulse quickening. The earth was moving, the soil shifting as though it were alive. The thorns of silence, those twisted, grotesque plants, were stirring. They were awakening. Suddenly, something broke through the earth in front of her. A hand, clawed, twisted but unmistakably human, shot up from the ground. Evelyn gasped, her body stiffening in shock. The hand reached for her, its fingers curling as if trying to grab hold of her. Evelyn stumbled back, her heart racing as the figure slowly emerged from the soil. It was Finn, but not the Finn she remembered. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow and dark. His mouth was open, but no sound came from him, just the low, mournful hum of the garden filling the silence between them. His body seemed to be pulled up from the earth, as if he were being dragged, but his movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet whose strings had been pulled too tight. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. "Finn," she whispered, but no words came from his mouth. His gaze locked onto hers, but there was nothing familiar in his eyes. The man standing before her was not the Finn she had known. It was a hollow shell, a puppet of the garden, consumed by the very thing he had tried to protect her from. His hand reached for her again, slow, deliberate. Evelyn took a step back, but her feet felt like they were sinking into the ground. She couldn't move. She couldn't look away. The thorns around her seemed to shift, to move, their stems curling and twisting, reaching for her as though they, too, wanted to claim her. Finn. No, Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling. What's happening to you? The figure of Finn swayed in front of her, his body jerking as though he was struggling against some unseen force. His mouth moved again, but the words he spoke were not his own. You shouldn't have come back. The voice that emerged from his lips was deep, guttural, like something that had been buried for centuries. It was not Finn. It was the garden, speaking through him, the curse that had been passed down through his family, through hers, all tied to the thorns, the price of the silence, the price of the memories. Evelyn shook her head, her eyes welling with tears as she stepped back again. The garden was not just a place, it was a force, a living, breathing entity that fed on their sins, on their silence. It was not just the thorns, it was everything, the land, the very air they breathed. It had consumed them all. Please, Evelyn whispered, her voice breaking. I didn't want this. I just wanted peace. I didn't want to be part of this curse. But the figure before her, Finn's broken, twisted form, did not respond. His eyes, empty and hollow, stared at her with something that was no longer human, something that had been lost to the garden. The thorns reached for her again, and Evelyn knew, deep in her bones, that she was at the center of it all. She had been from the beginning. The garden had claimed Finn. It had claimed Lillian. And now, it was coming for her. The question was, would she let it? The weight of Finn's twisted, hollowed form still pressed on Evelyn's chest as she backed away, her mind reeling, heart pounding in her ears. She couldn't tear her eyes away from him, his eyes that were no longer his own, his mouth that moved, but words that were not his, not any longer. The thorns had claimed him just as they had Lillian, just as they had claimed her brother, Samuel. Evelyn's breath came in sharp gasps, a raw, jagged thing, her heart racing faster with every step she took away from Finn. But the further she moved, the tighter the garden's grip seemed to grow. The thorns pulsed around her, their dark, twisted stems reaching for her as if they were hungry, waiting. The earth beneath her feet trembled as though the garden was coming alive, its roots awakening with a ferocity that made the very air heavy with dread. She didn't know where to run, or even if she could run. The garden was a labyrinth now, its branches, its roots, its vines weaving together to form a living prison. She could hear it, the faint hum of the thorns in the distance, but it felt as though it was closing in, becoming a constant, suffocating presence in her mind. Finn's voice echoed in her mind again. You shouldn't have come back. The words lingered like an accusation, a final warning from the garden itself. She had come here looking for answers, seeking peace, but what she had found was something far darker, far more insidious than she could have ever imagined. The garden wasn't just a place of memory. It was a force, a living, breathing entity that fed on the souls of those who came near, feeding off their guilt, their silence, their fear. Her knees felt weak, and she collapsed to the ground, the reality of it all crashing down on her. I didn't ask for this, she whispered to herself, her voice hoarse. But even as she said the words, she knew it wasn't true. She had always been part of this. The garden had been waiting for her to come back, to face the truth. She had tried to escape it for years, running from her own memories, from the grief of her brother's death. But now, it was undeniable. The garden had been feeding on her the entire time. A low growl rumbled from the earth, a sound deep and unsettling, and Evelyn looked up to see something far worse than Finn's broken form. The thorns around her began to shift again, their petals unfurling as if to reveal something new, something darker. The roots underfoot twisted like living serpents, and as Evelyn stared, the ground cracked open in front of her. From the depths, of the earth, a figure began to emerge, slowly, impossibly. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as she recognized it. Her own face. But it wasn't her. Not exactly. The figure that rose from the ground looked like her, but it was wrong. Its skin was pale, almost translucent. Its eyes a dull, lifeless, grey. There was something hollow about it, as if it were a reflection of herself, something distorted and twisted. It rose from the soil with slow, unnatural movements, its body jerking like a marionette on broken strings. Evelyn couldn't look away, her heart in her throat, her mind unable to process the horror that stood before her. The doppelganger reached out a hand toward her, its fingers trembling with a cold, dead intensity. "You've come so far, Evelyn," it whispered, its voice a distorted version of her own, dripping with malice. "But this is where it ends. This is where you belong." Evelyn's heart hammered against her chest as she staggered backward, shaking her head, her body trembling with fear and revulsion. "No," she whispered, barely able to breathe. "You're not me. You're not real." But the figure, her figure, stepped forward, its movements jerky and inhuman. "I am you," it hissed. "All that you've hidden, all that you've buried, this is the price you will pay. The garden feeds on your silence, and now it has you. There is no escaping me. There is no escaping the truth." Evelyn's mind screamed, a sharp, guttural thing that clawed at her thoughts. This was the garden, showing her the deepest, darkest part of herself, her guilt, her unspoken grief. This figure, this twisted reflection, was a manifestation of everything she had kept buried for so long. Her failure to save her brother, the silence she had carried with her, the belief that she could escape it all. Her hands were trembling as she stood, her body unsteady. Her reflection, her dark twin, took another step forward, its mouth twisting into a smile that wasn't a smile at all. It was the smile of the garden, the smile of the curse. It was the smile of everything that had come before her. The thorns had not just been feeding on her fear. They had been feeding on her guilt, on her silence, on her memories. The garden wasn't just a place. It was a living embodiment of everything Evelyn had tried to escape, everything she had buried deep inside. It had become her past, her present, and now it was consuming her future. She could feel the roots of the thorns digging into the earth beneath her feet, a tightening, constricting force that was pulling at her. The ground seemed to rise, wrapping around her legs like vines, and the world around her began to blur as if it were slipping into a nightmare. The garden was closing in. The garden was changing her, becoming her. The figure stepped even closer, its cold, dead eyes locking onto hers. "You will never be free of this," it hissed. "You cannot outrun your past. You cannot escape the price of your silence." Evelyn's chest tightened as she tried to move, tried to escape, but the ground held her fast. The roots had entangled her, drawing her deeper into the heart of the garden. She could feel the life slipping away from her, the life that had once been hers, consumed by the thorns. But there was one thing she had not realized until now. The garden had not just been feeding on her, it had been feeding on everyone. Everyone who had ever been tied to this place. Her family, Finn, Lillian. The garden didn't just take lives. It took memories. It took the very essence of who they were, and in return it gave them nothing but emptiness. The truth was so much darker than she could have ever imagined. The garden wasn't just a curse. It was a prison built on the weight of silence, on the weight of guilt. And now, it had claimed her. "Evelyn," the figure whispered again, its voice now louder, more insistent, as it reached out to touch her. The cold, twisted fingers brushed against her skin, and she gasped, her body stiffening. It felt like death itself, a touch so cold and unyielding it numbed her to the core. There was no more running, There was no more escape. The thorns had fed on her for years, and now they had consumed her completely. But the question still lingered in her mind, echoing through the suffocating silence. Would she surrender to the garden, or would she fight it, even if there was nothing left to fight for? The air in the garden grew thick, heavy with an unexplainable pressure that seemed to settle over Evelyn like a dark cloud. Every step she took was slower, more deliberate, as if the garden itself was pulling her deeper into its web, its vines, its thorns. She could feel the earth beneath her shift, the soil writhing with an unsettling energy, as if the very land was alive and watching her. The hum, ever present and oppressive, was now a constant, vibrating in her chest, in her bones, in the very air she breathed. She could feel the thorns, their presence more tangible now, reaching out to her, tugging at her thoughts, her memories. The garden was no longer something she could stand back from. It was something that knew her, something that fed on her. And as she moved deeper into the thicket, the feeling only intensified. It was as if the garden had become a living creature, with eyes and tendrils that were always aware of her, always watching. The roots twisted and cracked underfoot, and the flowers, their deep red petals now shadowed with the darkest of hues, seemed to lean toward her, reaching out like the fingers of the dead. The moment she took a step toward them, they recoiled, only to snap back again as she moved. They were waiting. Her heart pounded in her chest. There was no running, not anymore. The garden was too vast, too intertwined with everything that had happened, everything that was about to happen, and then she heard it. A crack, sharp and echoing through the garden, like the breaking of a bone, a sudden rupture in the air. It was loud, deafening. Evelyn froze, instinctively lifting her hands to cover her ears, but the sound seemed to come from within, from deep inside her skull. The thorns trembled, their petals vibrating violently, as if they too were responding to something in the earth. A shadow moved in the corner of her vision. She turned sharply, her heart leaping in her throat. For a brief, fleeting moment, she thought it was Finn, or Lillian, or even her brother's ghost returning to her in some twisted form. But then she saw it, the shape emerging from the soil, crawling toward her, a dark silhouette against the pale light of dusk. It was not Finn, not Lillian. It was something much worse, a figure, humanoid in shape, but wrong, twisted. Its movements were jerky, disjointed, like something caught between life and death. It dragged itself forward, its form still half buried in the soil, as though it were struggling to free itself from the earth. The roots and vines seemed to coil around it, pulling it toward her. The figure's body was distorted, stretched unnaturally, its skin pulled tight across its bones, the texture resembling something that had been buried for too long. The figure's face was the most horrifying part. It was an amalgamation of faces, pieces of features distorted and fused together, like an unfinished mask. Its eyes were wide, unblinking, and as it looked at Evelyn, she felt the weight of its gaze on her, like a physical thing that pressed down on her chest. There was no recognition, no warmth in those eyes, only hunger. And then it spoke. "Evelyn," it rasped, its voice an unearthly hiss that scraped against her skin like 1,000 dry leaves. The words were slow, deliberate, filled with an unnatural echo. "It's time." Time for what? Evelyn's throat tightened, and she instinctively took a step back, her heart racing. The figure, it wasn't human. It couldn't be. The words came again, but this time they were louder, more insistent. "Time for you to join us." The ground beneath Evelyn's feet rumbled, and she could feel it, deep in her bones, the earth beginning to shift again, the roots breaking free from the soil like serpents. The thorns too began to writhe, their stems twitching as if alive, their once still petals now vibrating with an ominous energy. The figure slowly rose, dragging itself free from the earth. Its arms were long, impossibly long, and its fingers stretched out toward her, as if beckoning her forward. Its body seemed to bend in unnatural ways, the joints creaking, the bones crackling like dead wood. It was a thing born of the garden itself, something that had emerged from the soil, from the roots, a creature that had been waiting in the dark corners of the earth for her. The thorns seemed to part around the figure as it advanced, clearing a path. The garden was no longer a simple, sinister place. It was an altar, and she was the sacrifice. Her pulse quickened as the figure reached her, its hand, its clawed, twisted hand, outstretched toward her face. There was no escape. She was trapped in the garden, in its clutches, its twisted hold on her mind and body. The figure's eyes, those wide, hollow eyes, seemed to pull at her, drawing her in, paralyzing her with fear. It spoke again, this time louder, its voice ringing in her ears. "Your silence has brought you here." The words rang like a bell in her mind, reverberating through her thoughts. Silence. The garden fed on it. It had fed on her silence, her grief, her guilt for so long. It was the garden's sustenance. It was the price. The figure's long fingers hovered just inches from her face, and Evelyn knew deep within her that there was nothing she could do to stop it. The garden had taken everything. It had claimed her brother, Lillian, Finn, everyone, and now it was coming for her, drawing her into its embrace, into the suffocating silence that had bound them all. The figure's hand reached for her face, its touch cold and unyielding, like the fingers of death itself. And for the briefest moment, Evelyn closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable. The garden would claim her, just as it had claimed them all. But then, something changed. A sudden pulse of energy surged through the earth, rippling beneath her feet. The figure faltered for just a moment, its grip loosening, its twisted face writhing in pain. The ground trembled again, but this time the earth didn't crack in the way it had before. This was different. The thorns too seemed to flinch, their stems pulling back, the petals curling in on themselves. Evelyn opened her eyes just as a sharp crack split the air. The figure staggered backward, its distorted face twisting in rage. But before it could advance again, there was another shift, another pulse of energy, stronger this time. The garden was reacting. The thorns were pulling back, the figure was retreating, and Evelyn felt something shifting within her, her breath caught in her throat. The garden, the very thing that had held her in its grip for so long, was no longer the thing controlling her. Something was changing. And with that change, she realized, for the first time in years, she was no longer just a part of the garden. She was no longer just a victim. She was the one who could change it. And in that moment, Evelyn knew she had a choice. She could let the garden consume her, or she could fight back. But that fight would come at a cost. The air around Evelyn crackled with a strange energy, as though the garden itself had sensed the shift within her. The thorns, once so alive with hunger, now trembled, as if the very ground beneath them had become unstable. The distorted figure that had risen from the soil, her own twisted reflection, staggered back, its hollow eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and fury. Evelyn felt the pulse of power within her, a surging force that had come from somewhere deep within the garden. The roots, the thorns, the very earth, all of it seemed to be reacting to her. This is my chance. Her thoughts were sharp, her focus clearer than it had ever been. The garden had fed on her silence for too long. It had taken too much. She would not let it take her any longer. She stood tall, her knees no longer weak, her heart now steady in her chest. The weight of her brother's death, the pain of the years spent running from the truth, all of it. Suddenly, it felt lighter, as if the very soil beneath her feet had released its hold. allowing her the freedom to act, to fight back. The energy. In the garden, the pulse was no longer an oppressive weight. It was a tether that connected her to the very source of the garden's power. And now, she could use it. The figure before her hissed again, its body writhing as if trying to find purchase on the shifting earth. But Evelyn was no longer afraid. This twisted version of herself, this thing made from her guilt, her grief, this was just another manifestation of the garden's power. And she knew now that she had the strength to break free. The ground beneath her feet cracked once more, and a new sound joined the cacophony, the sound of chanting, deep and ancient. It was a rhythmic, repetitive pulse that seemed to come from all around her. The thorns too began to hum again, but this time it was different. This hum wasn't filled with hunger. It was filled with something else, something she hadn't noticed before. The garden had awakened, but it was not just awakening to her, it was awakening to the truth. The garden was ancient, older than her family's curse, older than the land itself. And the ritual that had bound them all to it was not just a curse, it was an offering. The thorns reached out to her, but not with their usual hunger. Instead, they seemed to respond to her presence, growing, twisting, blooming, as if they were listening, understanding. She felt the pull, the force that had drawn her to this place, the weight of generations of her family feeding it, and she knew the ritual wasn't just about silence, it was about a trade. And now, for the first time, she understood the true nature of the pact her ancestors had made. They had given themselves over to the garden. They had given their voices, their memories, their lives, and they had kept the thorns alive. The thorns were not just plants. They were conduits. They were the living embodiment of the pact, the ritual itself, a balance between those who had sacrificed and the garden that had consumed them. Evelyn felt the weight of it, the truth of it, like a stone sinking to the bottom of her chest. The garden had not just been waiting for her, it had been waiting for the right time. The time when she would come back, when she would face the garden, when the last piece of the ritual could finally be completed. Her heart beat faster now as the realization settled into her bones. She was the final piece. The figure of herself, twisted, contorted, continued to writhe, its voice filling the air. You can't escape. You're the sacrifice. Her reflection, the garden's reflection, was right. She was the sacrifice. Her family had given everything to the garden, to the ritual. The pact had never truly been broken. And now, it was her turn. She had come to Hollowthorn to escape it all, to find peace. But in the end, there was only one path. She had always been the final piece of the ritual. The chanting around her grew louder, filling the air, surrounding her, wrapping around her like an unseen force. The thorns, no longer just plants, began to stretch their roots, pulling them toward the center of the garden, forming an intricate pattern. The very earth seemed to pulse in time with the chant, vibrating with an energy that made Evelyn's body hum in response. The figure of herself, the twisted thing born of guilt and grief, continued to struggle in the shifting soil, its movements jerky, distorted. "It's time," the figure hissed, its voice layered with 1,000 whispers. The words came from every direction, from the very air itself, from the garden. Time for you to become one with it. Time for the garden to claim its prize. Evelyn felt the pull of the thorns, the roots that were now stretching toward her, like tendrils creeping along the earth, wrapping around her legs. She could feel them, their cold embrace, and for a moment she thought she might collapse under the weight of it. But then, something inside her snapped. The garden was not just a thing to fear, it was a thing to break. She had been part of this, yes, but she was also the one who could change it. The garden had fed on her grief, on her silence for so long, but it could no longer control her. It could no longer make her its victim. The air around her pulsed with energy. The thorns began to bend back, their roots retracting, their petals curling as if they were afraid. The sound of the chant began to grow chaotic, the rhythm of the garden faltering. And then, just as Evelyn thought she might lose herself completely to the force, the garden broke. She felt it in her chest, a sharp crack, like the breaking of glass, as the garden's pulse faltered. The roots recoiled from her legs, the vines snapping away as if they had been burned. The thorns, once so alive with hunger, began to wither, their petals curling in on themselves, turning black. The figure of herself, the twisted reflection of guilt and memory, howled in rage, but the sound was swallowed by the garden's fading hum. Evelyn's heart raced in her chest as she stepped forward, pushing past the figure, walking toward the heart of the garden. She could feel the energy within her, the tether that had once connected her to the garden, snapping. She could feel the power, the silence, the ritual that had bound her to this place, unraveling. With each step, she felt the garden lose its grip on her, the power of the ritual weakening. The thorns shriveled, their dark vines no longer reaching out for her, no longer pulling at her. She had broken the pact. She had freed herself. And as she reached the center of the garden, the soil beneath her feet cracked, the hum of the garden fading into nothingness, replaced by an eerie silence. The garden had been feeding on silence for generations, but now, for the first time in years, Evelyn felt an absence of that. The silence was gone. The garden was no longer waiting. It was no longer hungry, and Evelyn was finally free, but she knew now the price of freedom was not without its cost. The ritual had been broken. The garden was fading, but the truth was clearer than ever. The cost of the garden's power had always been choice. The choice to feed the thorns, the choice to break the silence, and the choice to speak. Her voice, once lost in the hum of the garden, now echoed in the empty space. But the question remained, would it ever truly be over? Evelyn stood at the heart of the garden, the once feeding thorns now withering in the wake of her defiance. The pulse of the earth had diminished, the oppressive hum of the garden fading into an eerie stillness. She could feel it, the power that had controlled her, that had trapped her and her ancestors for generations, now unraveling at her feet. The vines and roots that had once threatened to consume her lay crumpled and lifeless, retreating back into the soil from which they had sprung. But there was something else, something she hadn't expected. The ground beneath her feet trembled. Again, not from the garden's power, but from something deeper, something older. The soil cracked, and a sharp, unnatural noise filled the air. It wasn't the garden fighting back, but something else. A force buried beneath the earth for centuries, a force that had been bound by the same curse that had entrapped her family. The garden wasn't the true enemy. It had been a conduit, a manifestation of a far darker, deeper power, one that had only been waiting for the right moment. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as the earth in front of her cracked wide open. From the dark chasm that formed, something began to emerge. The very soil seemed to reject whatever was coming forth, the ground writhing as though fighting against it. Her heart pounded, her mind racing, trying to make sense of the impossible thing unfolding before her. She had thought the garden's power had faded, but now she understood. The garden was a prison, and the prison had been keeping something much worse inside. A hand emerged from the earth, pale and gnarled, its fingers long and skeletal. The hand twisted upward, claws scraping at the edges of the chasm, pulling itself free of the soil with a terrible, relentless force. Evelyn staggered back, her breath catching in her chest. From the depths of the earth, the figure began to rise. It was not a person, not a man, not even a human. It was a presence, a thing that was both ancient and new, a twisted creation that had existed long before her family had ever set foot on this cursed land. The figure emerged fully from the earth, towering over her, its form shrouded in shadow. Its features were indistinct, blurred, and constantly shifting. It had no clear face, no eyes, no mouth, but its form radiated an undeniable power, an ancient, terrible presence that made Evelyn's skin crawl. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. The garden's hum had ceased, but now the air around her vibrated with a new, darker energy. The thorns, the vines, the roots, they all twisted in unison, drawing themselves into the figure like strings being pulled by some invisible force. The entire garden seemed to feed into the dark presence, coiling around it, forming a grotesque, living figure. The ground itself groaned under the weight of it, the earth cracking and splitting, the roots tangling and twisting. The figure stood before her, the very embodiment of the curse, the true source of the garden's power. Evelyn felt her heart race, the intensity of the moment clawing at her chest. It was no longer just about breaking the pact. No, the curse was far older, far deeper than she had ever realized. This was the source of the ritual, the force that had bound her family to this land. The price of their silence. A voice echoed in her mind, not spoken aloud, but felt in the deepest parts of her soul. You should never have come back. The words weren't her own thoughts. They came from the thing before her. A voice so ancient that it felt like a primal force, an ancient echo that reverberated through her very being. The garden had been a prison, yes, but it had been a veil, a barrier holding this creature at bay. The truth of the ritual had not been about a sacrifice of blood, but a sacrifice of freedom. The garden had been feeding this entity, keeping it contained, for as long as her family had lived on this cursed land, they had thought they could control it. They had thought they could silence it with their silence, their guilt, their sacrifices. But all along, they had only been feeding it. And now Evelyn knew the sacrifice was not hers alone to make. Shaktul figure moved toward her, its form still shifting, the darkness inside it flickering like a living shadow. The thorns recoiled as it approached, as if afraid of what was about to unfold. The vines and roots, still grasping at the air, seemed to be drawn toward it. It reached out to Evelyn, not with hands, but with an invisible force, pulling at her chest, at her very soul. She could feel it now, the weight of the choice she had to make. This creature, the true curse of Hollowthorn, was not a thing of nature, not a thing of the garden. It was a spirit, an ancient force bound by the ritual her family had made. Her ancestors had sacrificed their freedom, their lives, their voices, to keep this entity at bay. They had built the garden as a cage, feeding it with their grief, their silence. But now, the cage was breaking, and the creature that had been imprisoned for so long was free. But Evelyn understood something in that moment. The power of the ritual wasn't in the garden. It was in her. She had always been the one who could change it. She had always been the one who could make the choice. And now, she was the key to ending the curse, for good. But there was no escape from this choice. There was no running from and the creature, this ancient force, was feeding off the garden, and if she didn't stop it, it would consume everything. The garden would no longer just be a curse, it would be the end. It would destroy everything in its path. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest, the weight of the decision pressing on her like an unbearable weight. If I stop it, I will have to sacrifice everything. I will have to destroy the garden. I will have to destroy the last remnants of my family's legacy. The figure before her extended a hand made not of flesh, but of shadow. The darkness seemed to reach out, wrapping around her, pulling her toward it. "This is the end," it whispered. "Your sacrifice, your choice." Her breath caught in her throat, and she felt the weight of the garden's history, the weight of everything that had been lost pressing on her. The thorns, the vines, the roots, they all seemed to be waiting, the earth itself holding its breath, awaiting her decision. With one final shuddering breath, Evelyn took a step forward. "It's time to end this." She stepped into the center of the figure's reach, her hand outstretched to meet its shadow. And in that moment, Evelyn understood. To destroy the curse, to free the garden, she would have to sacrifice her own silence. She would have to release herself from the prison of guilt, of grief, of fear, and speak the words that had been buried for so long. "I remember," she whispered, her voice trembling but steady. "I remember the truth." And with those words, the curse broke. The ground trembled, the thorns writhed in agony. The garden groaned, and the figure, whatever it had been, began to fade, its form dissolving into the earth from which it had emerged. Evelyn felt the garden release her, the weight of the silence lifting, the chains breaking. But she knew in that moment that the cost of freedom had been her voice, her memories, her very soul. And as the garden's hum faded into nothing, Evelyn realized she had broken the curse, but at what cost? The earth beneath Evelyn's feet shuddered as the figure dissolved into nothingness, fading into the soil like a shadow swallowed by light. The thorns, once fierce and alive with hunger, now lay still, their once bloody petals crumpling and blackening. The roots that had been pulling at her legs receded, retreating into the earth like fading memories, unwilling to hold her any longer. The oppressive hum that had filled the air, the constant suffocating presence of the garden, died down, leaving only an eerie stillness behind. Evelyn stood alone in the center of the garden, breathing heavily, her body shaking with the aftermath of what had just transpired. The ground beneath her had stopped moving. The cracks that had opened to release the creature now sealed, the roots that had tried to bind her now nothing more than dried husks. The silence that enveloped her was unlike any she had ever known. It wasn't the silence of the garden that had once weighed heavily on her, pulling at her thoughts, suffocating her with its relentless hum. This was something else. This was the absence of everything that had held her captive for so long. Her eyes roamed over the remnants of the garden, now falling apart before her. The thorns, which had been the beating heart of the curse, were wilting, their red petals curling into themselves like dying embers. The twisted vines and roots that had once ensnared everything in their path now seemed powerless, lifeless. The garden that had once seemed endless, a living prison, was now a broken, decaying thing, just like the truth she had uncovered. And yet, even in the silence, something felt wrong. Evelyn's chest tightened as she took a step forward, her gaze still locked on the dead garden. The weight of the ritual, the broken pact, the destruction of the garden, the unraveling of the curse, pressed on her like a heavy cloak. She had broken the cycle. She had freed herself and her family from the suffocating grip of the garden. But in doing so, she had paid a price. And that price was not just the garden's destruction, it was the silence she had carried with her for so long. As she stood there, alone in the garden's ruins, the truth of her sacrifice began to settle in. The silence that had once been a comfort to her, the silence that had shielded her from the grief of her brother's death, was now gone. She had given it up in exchange for the garden's destruction. But now she realized the silence had been more than a shield. It had been a prison, a cage she had built for herself to keep the memories of her past at bay. Without it, she was, left to confront everything she had buried, everything she had run from. The first tears began to fall. Evelyn's hands trembled as she wiped them away, her chest aching with the weight of everything she had lost. The loss of her brother, the loss of her family, the loss of the life she had once known. But it wasn't just the loss of the past, it was the loss of the future she had imagined, the future in which she could live free of the garden's pull, free of the thorns, free of the curse. But now there was no escape. The silence was gone, the garden was gone, and all that remained was her standing in the remnants of everything she had destroyed. She had broken the curse, yes, but in doing so she had released herself from the prison of silence. And now she had to face the truth. She could feel the weight of it, every memory, every regret, every moment of guilt she had carried for so long. The silence had protected her from facing it, but now there was no shield, no wall to hide behind. Evelyn's hands clenched into fists as the memories of her brother, of his final moments, crashed over her like a tidal wave. She could still see his face, twisted in fear as he slipped beneath the water. The cold, suffocating water, the silence that had followed him into death. For years, she had tried to bury it. She had silenced herself, thinking that if she didn't speak of it, if she didn't think about it, she could somehow escape it. But now, the silence was gone. The memories were flooding back. She couldn't run anymore. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words barely audible, but they felt like the only thing she could say. The only thing left. The wind stirred through the garden's ruins, a soft whisper on the breeze. The thorns had gone, the vines had fallen, but the garden itself was still with her, still a part of her. The silence had been broken, and with it, the truth had been set free. But now, Evelyn had to learn to live with it. She had to find a way to move forward, to live in a world without the garden's hum, without the curse that had defined her family's past. And that, she realized, was the hardest part. The hardest part was not breaking the curse, not facing the garden, but living after. Living with the guilt, living with the memories, living without the silence that had once protected her. She turned away from the ruins of the garden, her heart heavy, but her steps more purposeful. The weight of the past still clung to her, but now, for the first time, she could move forward. She could hear the world outside the garden, its sounds, its life, its noise, and she knew that while the silence had been her shield, it had also been her prison. Now the question was not whether she could survive the truth, but whether she could find a way to live again. With one final glance at the garden, Evelyn began to walk away, the wind carrying the remnants of the hum with it, but no longer holding her in its grip. She had been part of the garden for so long, but now she was free, and for the first time in years, she could breathe. Evelyn's breath was shaky, but it steadied with every step she took away from the garden. The broken thorns, once powerful, now lay scattered across the soil, shriveled and weak, their petals no longer vibrant with the blood-red hue that had once been so synonymous with their hunger. The air around her felt different now, lighter, free from the oppressive hum that had suffocated her for so long. Yet, there was something still clinging to her, something darker that lingered in the corners of her mind. Even as she walked away from the ruins of the garden, the weight of it, the curse that had been passed down through generations, felt like it had been replaced by something else, a presence that she could feel, but not quite see. It was as though the garden had not entirely surrendered its grip. Despite the silence, despite the breaking of the curse, something still hung in the air, waiting, watching. The wind picked up, and Evelyn paused, her heart thudding in her chest. She could hear a faint whisper just at the edge of her hearing, as though the earth itself were speaking to her. It was a voice that was familiar, but she couldn't place it. She looked around, but there was no one. The world around her seemed untouched by the chaos of the garden's fall. The trees, their leaves swaying gently in the wind, were calm, peaceful. Yet she knew that something had shifted. Something was wrong. Evelyn. She froze. The voice. Her brother's voice. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. Her body tensed as she turned, searching the empty space behind her, but all she saw was the dying garden. Her heart beat faster, but there was no sign of him, no figure in the distance. The voice lingered in her mind, heavy with longing, regret, and sorrow. It was as though Samuel was calling to her, but from beyond the veil. "Help me." Evelyn's breath hitched. Her chest tightened with the pressure of the words that echoed in her mind, and her hands trembled. She could feel it. The pull of the voice, the pull of the past, the voice of the garden. It was drawing her back, pulling her toward the place she thought she had left behind. The garden had fed on silence, on grief, and now it was using Samuel's voice to call her back into its depths. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, this isn't real." But the pull of her brother's voice was too strong. She couldn't escape it. She had spoken the truth. She had broken the silence that had kept her bound to the garden, to the curse. But now, the truth was coming back to her, not as a release, but as a new prison. She felt her feet move forward, almost against her will. The voice, continuing to call her name. Her mind screamed at her to stop, but her body wouldn't listen. The garden was not done with her. It had been silent for too long, but it was now louder than ever. The ground beneath her feet trembled once again, but this time it was not the cracks of the earth breaking apart. It was something else, something more alive. The soil shifted, and the thorns that had once been dead stirred, their roots snapping into life, reaching for her like fingers, longing to pull her back into the depths. No. Evelyn's breath came in ragged gasps as she stumbled backward, her body instinctively trying to retreat. But the garden was no longer just a place. It was alive, a physical manifestation of everything she had been running from. The thorns rose again, their jagged stems reaching out, but they were no longer just plants. They were becoming something else, something darker. The vines were twisting into something more physical, more real. The ground split as the earth began to pulse with an unnatural energy, and from the cracks, something else began to emerge, something darker, something that had been waiting. From the very roots of the garden, something began to take shape. At first, it was a shadow, a figure, moving slowly as it crawled from the earth. But as it rose, Evelyn could see it clearly, its form distorted and grotesque. It was not a person. It was an entity, a physical manifestation of the curse, of everything the garden had been feeding on. Its body was wrapped in vines and thorns, its face obscured by shadow. There was no feature to define it, just darkness, endless and consuming, shifting like a living thing. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. The garden, once a thing of whispers and shadow, had now come into the light. And it was alive. And it was here to take everything from her. The entity moved toward her, slow at first, but its pace quickened with every step, its form twisting and writhing as it approached. The thorns wrapped around it like a cloak, and its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, flashed a sickening green, bright with hunger. The air around her grew thick, and for the first time, Evelyn could feel it. The pull of the garden, the weight of the curse, pulling her back into its darkness. The ground beneath her feet continued to tremble, the garden alive with the force of the entity's approach. The thorns, the vines, the roots, they were no longer just part of the earth. They were a part of it, part of the thing that was emerging, part of the force that had been feeding off her grief, her silence, for so long. The entity reached toward her, its hand, if it could even be called a hand, twisting and stretching. Out like the roots of the garden, sharp thorns sprouting from its fingertips. The shadow that had once been her brother's voice was now something darker, something that sought only to consume her. And as its hand reached for her, she knew the truth. The garden had manifested. It had been waiting for her to break the silence, to free it. And now it was taking form. The curse was no longer just a force that whispered from the shadows. It had become something real, something she could touch, something she could feel in her very bones, and it was coming for her. Evelyn's heart raced as she stepped back again, fear clawing at her chest. She had faced the garden's twisted forces before, but now it was not just a presence in the air. It was here, physical, corporeal, demanding its price. The garden had broken the silence, but what would it take in return? With one last desperate glance at the dark figure that was coming toward her, Evelyn understood what she had to do. The choice had always been hers. The sacrifice was not to be made to the garden. It was to be made by her. Evelyn's legs trembled as she backed away from the entity, the weight of the curse pressing in on her chest. Every step she took was slower than the last, the ground shifting beneath her feet, the garden's roots snapping toward her with unnatural speed, as if hungry for her. She could feel the pull of the thorns, their thorns stretching and swaying, reaching for her like fingers pulling at her soul. The air felt thick with energy, with the weight of something old, something ancient that had been waiting for this moment, the moment when she would face the consequence of breaking the silence. She had thought she was free. She had thought that by breaking the silence, by confronting the garden, she had destroyed the curse. But now, the true nature of the curse had revealed itself. The garden had been a veil, a prison that kept something far worse hidden beneath, the earth. And in breaking the silence, in releasing the garden from its shackles, she had unwittingly awakened it. The figure, the entity, whatever it was coming closer now. It moved with terrifying purpose, its body still wrapped in vines, its thorns cracking the earth with each step it took. The air around it rippled with dark energy, vibrating with the power it held, as if the garden itself had become a living being, a force of nature that could not be stopped. The figure was an embodiment of everything the garden had been, everything it had fed on: guilt, grief, silence. Now, it was here to collect its price. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest, each beat a painful reminder of how close she was to the final moment. She had spent years running from the truth, hiding behind silence, hiding behind her guilt. She had buried her grief, her brother's death, the broken promises. She had hidden from the past, thinking that if she didn't speak of it, if she didn't face it, it would never come for her. But now, in the heart of the garden, the truth was standing before her. The entity, its dark form now towering over her, spoke again. Its voice was not a voice at all, but a terrible presence, an overwhelming feeling that pulsed in the air, that vibrated through her chest, through her very soul. Evelyn, it is time. The words were not a question, not a plea. They were a declaration. The garden, the entity, had been waiting for her to face this moment, waiting for her to realize that the price she had paid to break the silence was not enough. The ritual had been incomplete. Her family's sacrifice, her brother's death, Lillian's fate, had been part of it. But now it was her turn. The garden required its final payment, and Evelyn knew deep in her bones what that payment would be. Her breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced. What could she do? The entity extended a clawed hand toward her, its long fingers stretching toward her face. Its touch was cold, unnatural, like ice on her skin. Evelyn flinched, her instinct screaming at her to move, to run, but she couldn't. She was frozen in place by the weight of the decision before her. The price of breaking the silence was not just the loss of the garden, not just the end of the thorns. It was the price of her very soul. It was the choice between surrender and sacrifice. The silence cannot remain broken, the entity whispered, its voice a hollow echo, like the wind through a dead tree. You freed us, you released the garden, and now you must pay. There is no other choice. There is no escape. The roots were tightening now, wrapping around her legs, pulling her closer to the entity. Evelyn's hands shook, and she fought against the pull, but it was futile. The ground was alive with the garden's will. The thorns were reaching for her, their sharp tips pricking at her skin as if waiting to consume her. Please, she whispered, her voice cracking, her throat dry with fear. What do you want from me? The figure tilted its head, its face still shifting, its features constantly changing, as though it could not decide what it wanted to be. The vines and thorns twisted around its form, its body coiling like a snake, the very garden itself entwining around the dark figure. The price has already been paid, it replied, the sound of the words vibrating through her very core. Your family's silence, your brother's death, Lillian's fate, they were all part of it. And now, the entity's voice grew louder, more insistent, filling her mind with an oppressive weight. Now you must give yourself. Evelyn's chest tightened, and her heart raced faster. Give myself. You must become part of the garden, the entity said, its voice heavy with finality. You must sacrifice what you have fought so hard to protect, your memories, your life, your soul. Become one with the earth, and the garden will be free. The world seemed to tilt around her as the thorns closed in, their petals sharp, their hunger insatiable. Evelyn's legs trembled beneath her, and she could feel her body growing weak, the pull of the roots dragging her down. The choice lay before her, dark and heavy, surrender or sacrifice. She could surrender. She could allow herself to become part of the garden, part of the curse that had plagued her family for so long. She could let the entity consume her, let the thorns claim her, and end it all. She could become nothing, and in that nothingness, the garden would thrive. But she could not. She could not give up. She could not let the garden claim her, not after everything she had been through. Not after breaking the silence, not after confronting the truth. Her brother's face flashed in her mind, the look of fear, the silence that had consumed him, the guilt that had gnawed at her for so long. No more. No more silence. No more grief. Evelyn stepped forward, her resolve hardening. Her heart was still pounding, but her body moved with purpose. She reached out, her hand trembling, and she grabbed hold of the vine closest to her. The garden pulled at her, but she resisted. No, she whispered, her voice stronger now. I will not become part of you. I will not let you take me. The figure seemed to recoil, the air thickening around her, its presence more oppressive than ever. The roots tried to tighten, but Evelyn's grip on the vine tightened as well, pulling herself free of the garden's grasp. You cannot escape, the entity rasped, its voice growing louder, more insistent. But Evelyn didn't listen. She had made her choice. She had already sacrificed everything, her family, her silence, her past. And now, the final sacrifice would be her refusal to become part of the curse. She closed her eyes, and with a deep breath she yanked herself free. The earth around her trembled, but she stood firm. This was her final stand, her final act of defiance. The garden, the entity, the curse, they would not claim her. She would be the one to break the cycle, to stop the thorns from feeding, to stop the silence from consuming her. And with that thought, the garden screamed its final agonized howl. Evelyn's heart raced as she tore herself free from the grasp of the thorns, the roots snapping at her ankles, the vines curling around her legs in futile attempts to drag her back into the earth. The entity, a twisted mass of darkness and shadow, recoiled, its form shifting violently as if recoiling from her refusal to surrender. She felt the pull of the garden, the weight of the curse and the past, fighting her every step of the way, but she pressed forward, each movement stronger than the last. The earth beneath her feet trembled, the ground shifting and groaning as though the very land itself were protesting her defiance. The thorns had once been the garden's weapon, but now they were falling apart, their roots snapping like brittle threads. The garden, which had been her prison for so long, was now unraveling, its power weakening with every step she took away from it. And yet, as the garden's grip loosened, Evelyn felt the burden of her own choices. Her breath was ragged as she took another step. The price. She could feel it now, heavier than anything she had ever carried. It wasn't just the garden's destruction. It wasn't just the breaking of the silence. The cost was the breaking of the curse that had bound her family for generations. As the last remnants of the thorns faded into dust, Evelyn looked up at the dying garden, the once vibrant, plants now wilting, shriveling, decaying before her eyes. The weight of it all pressed down on her chest, suffocating her. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the promise of something finished, and yet it felt like the end had not quite come. Something was still missing, something still tugged at her heart. She had faced the garden's physical manifestation. She had confronted the entity, and in doing so, she had broken the curse. But there was still one thing left. One thing she hadn't considered until now. What would happen to her now? The silence was no longer oppressive. The garden no longer hummed with the weight of centuries-old guilt and grief. But Evelyn knew that her battle wasn't over. The garden had fed on her family for generations. And it wasn't just a matter of breaking the curse. It was about what would remain in the wake of the destruction. The choices she had made had shattered the cycle, but in doing so, she had changed the very fabric of her reality. The ground around her cracked again, and this time the noise wasn't one of victory. It wasn't the sound of the garden crumbling, but the sound of something else. Something that had been buried, like the garden itself. Something waiting. Evelyn's pulse quickened as she turned to face the source of the sound. From the earth, a familiar figure began to emerge. His body half buried in the soil, his features distorted, and his eyes hollow with the same unnerving emptiness she had seen in the entity before. It was Samuel, but not Samuel. The figure was twisted, its body malformed and broken, as though it had been part of the garden's own corruption. His skin was pale and cracked, his eyes sunken and dull. The sight of him was enough to make Evelyn's chest tighten, her throat constricting with the realization that her brother, in some twisted form, had been part of this all along. Evelyn. His voice was soft, almost too soft, but it was his voice. It was Samuel's voice. Tears welled up in Evelyn's eyes as she stared at him, frozen in place, as if paralyzed by the sight of her brother standing before her in such a monstrous form. His body continued to emerge from the earth, his hands stretched out toward her as if seeking her touch, seeking her forgiveness, his lips moving but no sound escaping them. The earth groaned again, and Evelyn felt the pull in her chest, the agony of grief, of loss, of the silence that had consumed her for so long. She had been running from it, hiding from it, hoping that if she destroyed the garden, if she broke the curse, she could be free. But the truth was different now. The garden had not just been feeding on silence, it had been feeding on memories. And it had kept the dead alive, trapped in this place. The entity, the garden itself, had used her brother's memory as part of the ritual. Samuel's death had been part of the price. Her family's silence had fed the garden for so long. And now, in breaking that silence, in remembering, Evelyn had unleashed it. She had freed the garden, but she had also freed the lost souls trapped within it. The cost of breaking the curse was not just the destruction of the garden. It was the resurrection of everything it had consumed. "You can't save me, Evelyn," Samuel's figure whispered, his voice still soft but full of an otherworldly sadness. "I am a part of this, a part of the curse. You can never fix what's been broken." Evelyn's chest tightened as she reached out toward him, her fingers trembling. She wanted to call out to him, to tell him that she could save him, but the words wouldn't come. She couldn't bring him back. The silence that had kept her trapped, the guilt that had kept her paralyzed for so long, had fed the curse. And now it had returned to claim everything. Samuel's twisted form wasn't him anymore. It was just another manifestation of the garden's hunger. The roots reached out toward him, pulling at his body, pulling him back into the earth. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as she realized that this was the true cost of freedom. The garden had claimed him, just as it had claimed her, and now it was claiming everything again. But this time, Evelyn was ready. She had broken the cycle. She had faced the garden's physical manifestation. But this was the last test, the final sacrifice. The roots that had once pulled her down into the garden now reached for the figure of her brother, but she wouldn't let them. She wouldn't let the garden take him again. She wouldn't let it take her. "No," she whispered, her voice stronger now. She stepped forward, her hands trembling, her heart aching, but her resolve hardening. "I won't let you take him, not again." She reached out, her hands grabbing hold of the twisted, gnarled roots as they tried to pull Samuel back into the earth. The moment her fingers touched the roots, a shock of energy surged through her body, making her gasp. The garden was alive, with power, but she could feel it. The garden was not stronger than her, not anymore. With one final strained scream, Evelyn pulled. She pulled with everything she had, feeling the weight of the garden's energy crackling around her. But she did not let go. The roots broke, the vines shriveled and snapped, and the garden trembled. "Samuel, I love you." She whispered the words, knowing that they were enough. And in that moment, everything changed. The garden's grip shattered. The earth cracked open, the roots snapping like brittle twigs. The garden, once alive, once hungry, began to disintegrate. The vines and thorns crumbling to dust in the air. The air around her was clear, the weight of the curse lifting, the silence finally lifting from her soul. And then, for the first time in years, Evelyn felt the true cost of her freedom. She was finally free. But in that freedom, she had sacrificed everything she had left. The garden was gone. The curse was broken, and the silence that had once defined her, it was gone too. The silence that followed the shattering of the garden was overwhelming, suffocating in its own way. Evelyn stood at the center of the once vibrant, now crumbling garden, her heart still racing, her breath ragged in her chest. She had done it. She had broken the curse. The garden, the thorns, the entity that had twisted her family's legacy into something dark and consuming, they were all gone. The earth around her had ceased its trembling, the ground still, and the once living vines and roots had become little more than dust, carried away by the wind, and yet the victory felt hollow. She glanced around, her eyes lingering on the remnants of the garden, the place that had been both a prison and a constant in her life for so long. The thorns, once menacing and full of hunger, were now dead, their petals crumbled to nothingness, their stems brittle and broken. The garden, which had once suffocated her every waking moment, was no longer alive. But in its death, Evelyn felt only an aching emptiness, a hole left by something she had spent so long fighting. But now, in its absence, there was nothing to fill it. The wind stirred through the remnants of the garden, and Evelyn's eyes flitted to the ground, her heart heavy with the weight of everything she had lost. Samuel. The thought of his name hit her like a punch to the gut, and she swallowed hard, fighting the tears that threatened to rise again. The twisted, broken form of her brother, the final apparition that had risen from the soil, was now nothing more than a fading echo of the garden's hunger. He had been part of it all, part of the price of the silence, and yet, in the end, the silence had betrayed them both. She had freed him, but in doing so, she had lost him again. The silence that had once been a comfort to her now felt like a graveyard, a cold, empty thing that reminded her of every unspoken word, every regret she had carried for years. The garden, in all its twisted power, had fed on her silence. It had fed on all of their silence. And now, in the wake of its destruction, there was only the void, the emptiness that had once been filled by the garden's terrible hum. Her hand instinctively reached up to her chest, fingers grazing the hollow spot where the silence had once lived, a place that now felt impossibly empty. The weight of the past, the weight of her brother's death, of her family's legacy, was now hers to carry alone. She had broken the curse. She had freed herself. But the price had been everything, everything she had known, everything she had been. Evelyn let out a breath, her eyes scanning the fading garden, the ruins of everything she had fought to escape. For so long she had run from the truth, from the memories of her brother, from the curse that had haunted her family. But now, in the ruins of the garden, in the aftermath of the destruction, she realized that running had never been the answer. Facing it, facing everything, was the only way to truly break free. She turned, her eyes lingering one last time on the garden's remains before she began to walk away. Her legs were heavy, as if the very act of leaving was a final surrender. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. The garden had been a prison, yes. But now she had to make her way into the world outside, a world that was both unfamiliar and terrifying. Would she ever truly be free? As she walked, her thoughts turned to Finn, to Lillian, to everyone who had been consumed by the garden. She had broken the curse, but in doing so, she had left behind so much. The silence that had bound her to the garden, that had held her captive in a world of grief and memory, had been shattered, and with it, the garden had died. But now, there was nothing to fill the emptiness. The wind howled through the open space, carrying with it the scent of something fresh, something new. It felt like the world was breathing again, as if it were waking up from a long, deep sleep. And yet, Evelyn's heart still felt heavy. She couldn't shake the feeling that the silence was still there, lurking in the background, waiting to pull her back. How could she escape it now? How could she live in a world where her brother, her family's past, were not just memories but echoes of something much darker? The garden had been her cage, but now she was standing at the edge of something new, something that was both terrifying and hopeful. The earth beneath her feet, once alive with the pulse of the garden, now felt solid, stable, almost foreign. But the absence of the garden left a void that had to be filled. The loss of everything she had known was impossible to ignore. She had won, yes, she had defeated the curse. But victory came at a cost. The silence, the grief, the memories. They were no longer things she could ignore, no longer things she could bury. They were hers now, and she had to find a way to live with them, to find peace in the world that had been left behind. And then, in the distance, she saw it. A small figure standing just beyond the broken garden's remnants, silhouetted against the setting sun. She stopped in her tracks, her breath catching. In her throat, For a moment, she thought she was imagining it. But then the figure moved, slowly, purposefully, toward her. She knew who it was before the figure even spoke. Evelyn. Finn's voice was soft, almost lost in the wind, but it was unmistakable. She stood still for a moment, her heart pounding as he approached. She didn't know what to say. How could she? After everything that had happened, after everything they had been through. "Is it over?" Finn asked, his voice uncertain, his steps tentative. His eyes searched hers, searching for something. For reassurance. For answers. Evelyn nodded, her gaze drifting toward the fading garden behind them. She had faced it. She had broken it. But now, as she looked at Finn, she realized the truth. The garden wasn't the only thing she had been running from. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible against the wind. "It's never truly over." Finn stepped closer, his eyes full of something she couldn't quite place. Perhaps regret, perhaps guilt, but also something else. Hope. She wasn't sure. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words seemed to die in his throat. And in that silence, they both stood, lost in the weight of everything that had come before. Evelyn didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if she could ever truly find peace. But for the first time, she knew that the journey, the fight, had been hers to make. She had broken the curse, but the healing, if it was even possible, was hers to find. And with that thought, she took a step forward. The echo of loss was still there, but it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The wind shifted, carrying with it the soft rustle of dead leaves and the distant sound of branches swaying in the trees. Evelyn stood still, her gaze locked on Finn, the distance between them filled with a heavy silence. Behind her, the ruins of the garden loomed like a spectre, its once vibrant colors now reduced to dust and decay. The thorns, once alive with hunger and power, were now nothing more than crumbled remnants, their twisted forms scattered across the ground. The oppressive hum had faded, but the lingering weight of the curse, of everything she had fought, still hung in the air. She hadn't expected this moment of finality, of reckoning. She had thought that breaking the curse, confronting the garden, would have been the end. But standing here, with Finn just a few steps away, she realized the truth. The garden was only part of the battle. The true test was not facing the garden's horrors. It was facing the aftermath, the consequences of breaking the silence, of shattering the past. The silence had protected her. It had kept her locked in a world of grief, of guilt, but it had also kept her alive, kept her from confronting the full weight of what had happened to her family. The garden had fed on her silence, yes, but it had also kept her bound to it, a prisoner in her own memories. The curse had been more than just an external force. It had been the very way she had existed, silent, broken, and haunted by the things she could not bring herself to face. Now, in the aftermath of the garden's fall, that silence was gone, and, with it, the burden of the past. Finn stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. But there was a tension in his movements, a hesitation that Evelyn could sense, even without the words. The space between them felt heavy, as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for her to make the final choice. She had come this far, had fought and sacrificed so much to break the garden's hold. But now, in the silence that followed, its destruction, the hardest decision awaited her. She could feel the weight of it, the price she had already paid, the death of her brother, the loss of Lillian, the breaking of her family's legacy. But the most painful part, the part that gnawed at her heart like a wound that wouldn't heal, was the cost of her own silence. Evelyn took a deep breath and turned away from Finn, her eyes sweeping over the empty land. the place where the garden had once thrived. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The truth, raw and undeniable, filled her chest. The garden had consumed her family, had fed on their grief, their guilt, their silence. And it had made them complicit in the curse, complicit in their own destruction. But she had broken it, hadn't she? She had shattered the cycle. She had freed herself. But now, there was nothing left to hold on to. The silence, the grief, the anger, all of it was gone, and she was left standing in the wreckage, in the aftermath of the choices she had made. Finn's voice broke through her thoughts, soft and uncertain. You did it, Evelyn," he said, his words thick with emotion. His voice cracked as he spoke again. "You broke the curse. You broke the silence." Evelyn's chest tightened, her mind spinning. "I didn't do it for you," she wanted to say. "I didn't do it for the garden." She had done it for herself, for the memory of her brother, for the family she had lost, and for the silence that had kept her bound in a cage of her own making. But Finn was standing there, and the weight of his presence, of the years spent side by side in the shadow of the curse, was too much to ignore. She turned to face him, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't break the silence, Finn. I destroyed everything." The words felt like a confession, a wound that had finally opened. She had sacrificed the silence that had protected her, the silence that had kept her from facing the truth. But in doing so, she had freed herself. But at what cost? Finn's eyes softened, his expression filled with sorrow and something else, something more tender. His hand reached out, hovering between them, as if unsure whether he should touch her or not. The space between them was still too heavy, still filled with everything they had been through, everything they had lost. "I never meant for it to be like this," Finn said, his voice cracking. "I never wanted you to carry the weight of this curse. I thought if we kept quiet, if we didn't speak about it, maybe it would go away, but I was wrong." Evelyn's chest tightened again, the truth of it all sinking into her bones. She had thought for so long that the silence, the distance, the hiding would protect her. But now she understood. The silence hadn't been a shield, it had been a cage. The curse had thrived on it, fed on it, but it had also made them complicit in its own twisted cycle. "I didn't want to keep living in the shadows," Evelyn murmured, her voice barely audible. "I didn't want to keep hiding from it, from everything." Finn's hand finally found hers, his grip gentle but firm. "You don't have to face it alone anymore." She closed her eyes for a moment, her heart aching with the weight of his words, the past, the curse, the silence. It had all led her here, to this moment. And now she had a choice. She could keep running, keep pushing forward, or she could finally face what was left. But what was left? The garden was gone. The curse was broken. But there was no going back to who she had been. The silence was gone, and with it, so was the part of her that had hidden in its shadows. Her fingers tightened around Finn's hand. She had broken the curse. She had freed herself. But what would that freedom look like now? Could she still find peace after everything that had happened? Was there a way to move forward from the wreckage? Or was this the moment where everything changed? The choice was hers. She could keep running from the past, from the guilt, from the grief. She could leave Hollowthorne behind and start fresh, but would it truly be a new beginning? Or just another escape? Or she could stay. She could face Finn, face the world, face herself. For the first time, she felt the true weight of the decision. The price of freedom was not just the end of the garden, not just the death of the curse. It was the cost of memory, of living with everything she had lost, of learning to forgive herself, and of finding a new path forward in a world without silence. "I don't know what comes next," Evelyn said, her voice filled with a strange mixture of resolve and uncertainty. But I'm not running anymore. Not from the past. Not from myself. Finn's eyes softened as he stepped closer, his presence a comforting weight at her side. He didn't speak, but his hand squeezed hers in silent understanding. Evelyn took a deep breath, the final breath that would mark the end of the curse, the end of the silence, and the beginning of everything that was to come. And in that breath, she made her choice. She would face what came next. She would confront the past, and she would step forward into the unknown. But she would do it with him, and together they would find a way to rebuild. The wind carried a chill through the empty land as Evelyn and Finn stood side by side, the last remnants of the garden fading into the distance behind them. The ground, once alive with the hum of thorns and twisted vines, now lay still, the silence more profound than ever before. The air, too, seemed to have shifted. The heaviness, the weight of the curse had lifted, but with it came the weight of something else, something she couldn't quite define, something that now filled the space where the garden's grip had once been. Evelyn stood tall, the first rays of dawn casting their light across the barren earth. The sky above was wide and open, the colors of the morning stretching out before her like an invitation. She had spent so long running from the past, from the things she had been forced to silence. But now, for the first time in years, there was no more running. There was only the future. There was only the walk forward, one step at a time, into a world that was both terrifying and hopeful. She glanced at Finn, who stood beside her. His presence was a comfort, yet a reminder of everything they had endured. They had faced the horrors of Hollowthorn together. They had broken the curse, faced the garden's horrors, and confronted the truth about their families. But now, they were left with the consequences of their actions, of their choices. The weight of everything still pressed against her chest, but there was no more silence to hide behind. There was no more barrier between the truth and her. Finn met her gaze, his eyes filled with an unspoken understanding. He didn't need to say anything. She could feel the same weight on him. They had both paid their price, but they had also found something new in the wreckage, the chance to rebuild. Evelyn took a deep breath, feeling the air fill her lungs, refreshing her in a way she hadn't realized she needed. She hadn't felt the air like this since before the garden, before the curse had taken hold. It was as though the land, the very earth beneath her feet, had been given a chance to breathe again just like her. And in that moment she realized something. She wasn't just free from the garden's curse. She was free from the silence, from the past, free to choose her own path. Her fingers curled around the pendant that hung from her neck, the last gift. Her brother had left her before he had died, before everything had gone wrong. The pendant was the symbol of their family's legacy, the symbol of the curse that had haunted them. It had been a reminder of everything they had sacrificed, everything they had lost. But now, in the light of the new day, it felt different. It wasn't a symbol of grief anymore. It was a symbol of change, of breaking free. She held it in her palm for a moment, then let it fall back against her chest, the cool metal warming against her skin. It was time to let go of the weight it represented. She didn't need the pendant to remember Samuel. She didn't need it to remember the pain or the grief. The garden had taken enough from her. The garden had stolen too much. And now, it was finished. "Are you ready?" Finn asked softly, his voice breaking the silence that had settled between them. There was something in his tone, uncertainty, but also hope. He was standing on the precipice, just as she was, waiting for the next step, waiting for the decision to be made. Evelyn paused, the question hanging in the air like a question she hadn't fully understood until now. Was she ready? Was she ready to leave behind the weight of the garden, to walk into the future with the knowledge that the past could no longer hold her? She looked up at the horizon, the colors of dawn brightening the sky, and then back at the place they had left behind, the place where the garden had once stood, the place that had defined so much of her life, her choices, her silence. It was gone now, a memory in the wind. The echoes of the past had faded into the distance. Yes, she realized, she was ready. I'm ready, she said, her voice firm, her heart steady. Ready to move on, ready to leave the past behind. With that, she took Finn's hand in hers, her grip firm and resolute. They had both fought to break free. Now, together, they could face what was to come. The world was wide open. They had both paid the price for their freedom, and though the journey ahead was uncertain, it was theirs to walk. And then, with one final look at the land that had once been their prison, they began to walk. The weight of the curse was gone. The silence shattered, and with each step they took, they moved further away from the past. The future was open to them now, a wide, uncharted territory that promised both challenges and possibilities. Behind them, the garden had vanished completely. Its thorns reduced to dust, its roots pulled back into the earth. The entity that had haunted them, that had waited for so long, was no more. It had been broken, consumed by the very silence that had held it together. And for the first time in her life, Evelyn felt the true weight of that silence lifting. The future was unknown, but it was hers to shape. The echoes of the past, of guilt, of grief, of the garden's hunger, were gone. There was no longer anything standing in her way. There was no more silence. There was only the road ahead, and with it, the chance to reclaim what had been lost. They walked together hand in hand into the unknown. The legacy of the garden was gone. The legacy of silence had been shattered, and in its place, there was only the chance for rebirth, the chance to live,